The man didn't knock. That was the first thing Amara noticed, not the four bodies filling the doorway behind him, not the rain-soaked overcoats dripping onto the office floor she'd mopped herself 3 weeks ago when the cleaning service stopped showing up. Not even the hour, which was 12 minutes past midnight. He didn't knock. He walked through the glass door of Halcott and Pierce Forensic Accounting, like the lock hadn't existed, like the closed sign meant nothing, like the building itself had been waiting for him to arrive and was simply relieved he'd finally shown up. And he walked directly toward her desk. Not her boss's office. Not the reception area. Not the filing room where the servers hummed and blinked in the dark. Her desk. Second row from the back, closest to the emergency exit she'd mentally mapped on her first day, because old habits from old places die slow. Amara Voss did not move. She stopped breathing somewhere between the moment the door opened and the moment he pulled the chair from across her workspace and sat down without being invited, without asking, without a single word spoken yet, and somehow that silence was louder than anything he could have said. If you've ever sat alone in a building at midnight and felt someone else's presence, us before you heard them, you already know what her body was doing right then. If you haven't, imagine it now. Because this is the moment that changed everything. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel tells the kind of stories that stay with you. Subscribe so you never miss one. Hit the like button if this one already has your attention. And drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that room. Back to Mara. Back to the man who just sat down across from her like he owned the air between them. Her name was Amara Voss, and she was 27 years old, and she had spent most of those 27 years learning how to take up as little space as possible. Not because she was small. She wasn't small. She was a full-figured black woman with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that rooms noticed before she wanted them to, which was the problem, really, and had always been the problem. Presence invites attention. Attention, in her experience, invited judgment. And judgment, in the places she'd grown up, had teeth. So she'd learned early to cancel herself out. Gray hoodies 3 sizes too big. Flannels worn loose over baggy jeans, regardless of the weather. Hair pulled back into the most unremarkable bun she could manage. She sat in the back of every room. She ate lunch at her desk. She arrived early and left to everyone else, so she didn't have to navigate the hallway conversations, where people looked her up and down and thought they were being subtle about it. She was invisible by design, and she had constructed that invisibility the way an architect builds a load-bearing wall carefully, deliberately, with the knowledge that removing it might bring everything down. The irony was that the one thing she could not make invisible was her mind. Amara was a forensic accountant, the way some people are natural musicians, not because she'd studied hard, though she had, not because she'd wanted the career, though she'd chosen it, but because numbers had always spoken to her, in a language that felt more honest than anything people said out loud. Financial records don't perform. They don't smile at your face and scheme behind your back. They tell you exactly what happened if you know how to read them. And Amara knew how to read them the way some people know how to read a room. That gift was the reason she was still in this office at midnight. She had been reviewing import company accounts for 3 days straight, a routine audit that had turned decidedly unroutine the moment she started pulling on a thread that didn't belong. A shell company here, a transit account there, transfers moving through Belize, then Cyprus, then somewhere with a banking code she'd had to look up because she'd never seen it before. Nearly $5 million, moved in fragments small enough to pass under automated flagging thresholds. But not small enough to pass under Amara. She'd been tracing the destination accounts for 6 hours when the front door opened. And now he was sitting across from her. Seo Ji-Hwan was 38 years old and dressed in a charcoal wool overcoat that hadn't come off a rack. His face was angular and composed the face of a man who had decided somewhere in his 20s to stop broadcasting his emotions because broadcasting them had cost him something he wasn't willing to lose again. He had the hands of someone who worked. Not soft hands, not the manicured hands of a man who'd bought his way to power without earning it. His eyes were dark splitting. His eyes were dark and still, and they moved across the papers on her desk with the unhurried precision of someone who reads environments the way Amara reads financial statements. He looked at her work before he looked at her face. That alone told her something about him, though she wouldn't have been able to say what. "You're the one who understands the numbers," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was delivered the way a person states an established fact: the sky is gray, the building is 5 stories. You are the one who understands the numbers. Amara's hands, which had been hovering over her keyboard, went still. Her first instinct was to deflect. She'd been deflecting since she was 9 years old in a group home in Tacoma where being too smart made you a target. She opened her mouth to say something like, "I'm just an associate. You should speak to Mr. Pierce," which was what the situation seemed to call for, which was what the frightened part of her brain was already composing. Ji-Hwan stopped her before she started. "Mr. Pierce," he said, glancing briefly at the closed office door, could not find his own name in a bank statement. "We both know that." He settled back slightly in the borrowed chair, unhurried, unbothered by the strangeness of the hour or the strangeness of the situation. "I'm not here to talk to Mr. Pierce," Amara said nothing. The 4 men behind him had not moved from the doorway. They weren't performing menace, they weren't flexing or pacing or resting hands on weapons. They simply stood there like furniture that happened to be breathing, and somehow that stillness was worse than aggression would have been. $5,430,000, Ji-Hwan said. Gone from port operations over the past 14 months. I know it exists. I know it moved. I know where it stopped being traceable through conventional means. His eyes came back to hers. And I know the firm that was quietly retained to look at those accounts is this one. Amara felt the heat leave her face. "I don't know what accounts you're referring to." The lie sounded thin even to her own ears. Ji-Hwan regarded her for a long moment. Not unkindly. More the way you'd look at someone who'd just tried to bluff at a card table and hadn't yet accepted that everyone else could see their hand. "Miss Voss," he said, and the fact that he knew her name, her actual name, not the firm's name, not Mr. Pierce's name, sent a cold wire of understanding through her chest. "You've been here every night this week past 11 o'clock. You have 3 separate monitors running simultaneous data pulls, and you've cross-referenced shell company registrations across 4 different jurisdictions in the last 72 hours. He paused. "That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't know what accounts I'm referring to." Her heart was doing something unpleasant. "You know exactly what accounts I'm referring to," he continued, and his voice was still even, still calm, still carrying that same quality of absolute certainty that made arguing with him feel like arguing with gravity. "What I need to know is how far you've gotten." "I'm nobody," Amara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm a junior associate at a small firm. Whatever you think I found, I don't think." He cut across her quietly. "Thinking is imprecise. I know that someone followed those funds to a point that made them dangerous to the person who moved them. I know that person will eventually realize this firm is closer to the answer than they're comfortable with." Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a recalibration. "And I know that when that happens, the most dangerous person in this building won't be me." The silence that followed was the heaviest Amara had ever sat inside. She understood what he was saying. She understood it with the clarity of someone who had spent years reading financials. She was good financial structures. She was good at following the logic of systems, and this logic was unflinching. Whoever had taken that money was connected enough to know the audit existed. Connected enough to know who was doing it, and if they were connected enough to know those things, they were connected enough to do something about the person getting closest to the truth. She was that person. Ji-Hwan watched her work through it. He didn't rush her. "You're coming with me," he said. Amara stood up. She wasn't sure why, exactly some reflex, some animal instinct that standing was better than sitting when someone just told you your life might be in danger from 2 directions simultaneously. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I don't know who you are." "You know exactly who I am." Again, that quiet certainty. "You've been looking at my shipping accounts for 3 days. She had. She'd recognized the company names woven through the shell structure 48 hours ago and spent the following day pretending she hadn't, because recognizing them had implications she wasn't ready to sit with. Seo Ji-Hwan was not a name that appeared in local news. He operated in a space below that level. where the real infrastructure lived. His organization controlled pieces of the Port of Seattle's logistics flow, 3 luxury hotel properties in Capitol Hill and South Lake Union, and an import-export network that legitimate investigators had circled for years without finding a way in. She knew who he was. She just hadn't expected him to walk through her door. "I'm not your accountant," she said. "No," Ji-Hwan agreed, standing now as well, buttoning his coat with the practiced ease of a man who was done with the conversation and had decided the matter. "You're the only person in Seattle who can find my money before the person who stole it buries it somewhere you can't follow." He looked at her directly. The men in the doorway shifted slightly, not threateningly, just a reorientation, like they'd received a signal she hadn't heard. "Which means right now, whatever you might prefer, being close to me is considerably safer than being here. You're kidnapping me. I'm offering you protection from a man who already knows your name and what you know." He held her gaze. "You can call it whatever makes you more comfortable." Amara looked at her monitors, at the spreadsheets still open. The thread she'd been following for 72 hours that now felt less like a professional accomplishment and more like a rope she'd been pulling without knowing what was attached to the other end. She thought about the car that had been parked across the street 2 nights ago. The one she'd noticed because it was there when she arrived at 9, and still there when she left at midnight, and she'd told herself it was nothing because telling herself things were. Nothing was a habit she'd built into her bones. Maybe it hadn't been nothing. "My computer," she said. Ji-Hwan nodded once, and one of the men moved forward, began carefully disconnecting her workstation with a professionalism that was somehow more unsettling than roughness would have been. Amara grabbed her bag. Her hands were shaking. She put them in the pocket of her hoodie, the oversized navy one, thick cotton, worn at the cuffs so nobody would see. "I need you to understand something," she said, and she made herself look at him directly. Even though every self-protective instinct she'd developed over 27 years was telling her to look at the floor. "I'm not afraid of you." Ji-Hwan looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face too fast for her to name. "I know," he said. She followed him out into the rain. The Seattle night swallowed them both. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. Amara sat in the back of a vehicle that smelled like leather and something expensive she couldn't identify, watching the city lights streak through rain on glass, running calculations she couldn't stop even when she wanted to. Someone inside Ji-Hwan's organization had moved $5 million. They'd done it slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that the safest theft is the one nobody notices until the thief is long gone. 14 months of quiet siphoning, each individual transfer small enough to hide inside legitimate logistics volume, each shell company established just long enough to serve its purpose before going dormant. It was objectively elegant work. Amara hated admiring it, but she did anyway. She had the specific professional appreciation of someone who worked in exposure for someone who had worked very hard not to be exposed. She didn't know yet who had done it. She had suspicions. The account structures she'd mapped pointed towards someone with deep operational knowledge of the shipping division, someone who understood exactly which transactions moved under which supervisory thresholds, someone who'd had years to study the system before deciding to exploit it. But suspicion wasn't proof, and proof was what had kept her at that desk until midnight. The estate appeared through rain and security gates like something from a different world, which it was, she supposed. Glass and stone climbing a hillside above Lake Washington, every light precisely placed, the kind of architecture that communicated power without having to say a word about it. A property that cost enough that people who saw it understood immediately they were looking at a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Amara stepped out of the vehicle and stood in the rain for a moment before one of the men held an umbrella over her with startling politeness. She hadn't expected that. She followed them inside. The house was warm and impeccably ordered, not the sterile perfection of a showroom, but the lived-in order of someone who controlled their environment the way they controlled everything else, deliberately, with an eye for what actually mattered. There were books on actual shelves, a half-finished glass of something dark on the end table near an armchair that faced the window. An architectural drawing rolled out on the central table, held flat at the corners by 4 separate objects that happened to be within reach: a phone, a remote, a coffee cup, a stone. A working house, a thinking house. Ji-Hwan appeared from somewhere deeper in the building, without his overcoat, in a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up. He gestured toward the room where her computer was already being set up on a secondary workstation, and looked at her with the same directness he'd used all night. "You have access to everything," he said. "Every server, every account structure, every transaction record going back 5 years. Whatever you need." He paused. "What I need is the source of that theft and the full extent of what was moved." Amara looked at the workstation, at the servers being connected, at the scope of what he was offering her, which was more raw financial data than most forensic investigators ever saw from an organization like his. "And when I find it," she asked. Ji-Hwan met her eyes. "Then we'll have that conversation." It wasn't reassuring. She hadn't expected it to be. She set her bag down next to the workstation, took off her soaked hoodie, the one beneath it was gray, slightly smaller but still big, still designed to disappear, and pulled out her glasses and her notepad. She sat down. She started working. It took her 4 hours that first night to understand the full architecture of what she was looking at. Ji-Hwan's organization was more complex than she'd reconstructed from the fragments available to her. At the firm, legitimate holdings threaded through and around operational accounts in ways that were sophisticated enough to be genuinely impressive, layered by someone who understood financial structure at a level that most people with accounting degrees couldn't approach. She respected it the way she respected any difficult puzzle. Around 4 in the morning, she looked up and found Ji-Hwan in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand, watching her work with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the calculating assessment of someone measuring an asset. Something more like the look people give when they see something they weren't expecting and aren't quite sure what to do with. "Cream?" he asked. "Black," she said. He crossed the room and set one of the cups near her keyboard, not in her workspace, not on top of her papers, but close enough to reach. He looked at her screens. "You've remapped the entire offshore structure," he said. "I needed the full picture before I could identify what's missing from it." She wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth helped. "The siphoning is cleverer than I expected. Whoever did this understood your volume patterns well enough to calibrate every individual withdrawal against your normal transaction noise. They've been doing this long enough that it became routine, which is actually how I found it. Routines leave marks." Ji-Hwan said nothing for a moment. "How long to trace it completely? If you keep giving me access, 2 days. Maybe 3, she glanced at him. "But you already know I'm going to find something you're not going to like." "Yes," he said simply. "Someone inside your organization." "Yes. And you already have a suspicion about who?" He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. "I have a suspicion about many things," he said, and left her to her coffee and her screens and the particular silence of a large house at 4 in the morning when everyone else is asleep and you are chasing money through the places it tried to hide. She found it on the second day. She hadn't been looking for Do-Yoon Baek. Specifically, she'd been following the money, which was how she always worked, because money didn't have loyalties and money didn't have motives. And money, unlike people, went exactly where it was directed without pretending otherwise. The funds moved through 4 shell companies, 2 of which were registered to a holding entity that controlled properties in Vancouver and 1 small import business in Tacoma. The Tacoma business had a registered agent, Amara, cross-referenced against 3 other filings before the pattern emerged, a name that appeared once in each company's documents, always in a minor capacity, always with just enough legitimate business logic to explain the presence. Do-Yoon Baek, Ji-Hwan's underboss, his lieutenant, the man who ran the casinos and supervised the shipping operations, which meant he had understood exactly where the siphoning needed to happen to stay below the automated thresholds, because he had written those thresholds himself. Amara stared at the connection map she'd built on her secondary monitor. She thought about what it meant, what it would mean. What happened to the person who delivered this particular truth to this particular man? She was still thinking about it when the door behind her opened, and she turned around expecting Ji-Hwan and found someone else entirely. Do-Yun Baek was 41, Korean-American, the kind of polish that comes from spending real money on appearing effortless good suit, perfect haircut, the understated accessories of a man who considered presentation a professional tool. He was conventionally handsome, in a composed, architectural way. He moved through the world like someone who had always understood that how you enter a room determines how the room receives you. He entered this one without acknowledging her. He stood near the doorway and looked at her screens. Then he looked at her. The assessment was slow and explicit, and unkind, the kind of once-over that was designed to communicate its conclusion before any words were used. His eyes moved from her face to the oversized hoodie, to her workspace and back again, and she felt it the way you feel weather, something cold moving across skin. "You can stop," he said. Amara turned back to her screens. I said, "Stop." His voice sharpened. "Whatever you think you're finding in the shipping division, you're done looking there. Mr. Ji-Hwan gave me access to. I don't care what Ji-Hwan gave you." He moved into the room now, not aggressively, but with the controlled precision of someone who expected resistance to disappear before he reached it. "You're a contractor, a temporary hire. You don't have standing here." He glanced at her clothes, the hoodie, the baggy jeans, the worn sneakers, with the deliberate visibility of someone making a point. "You know what you look like? You look like someone who should be delivering coffee, not going through private financial records." The remark landed the way those remarks always land, not with a crash, but with a sinking quality, like something slow giving way beneath weight. Amara had heard variations of this her entire life. She had heard them in foster homes and school hallways and professional offices where people shook hands with her male colleagues and glanced past her to look for someone more impressive. She knew exactly what this man was doing and why he was doing it, and the specific damage it was designed to cause. She also, in that moment, understood something else. He was afraid. Not of her, not exactly. He was afraid of what she'd found. He was here because he knew she was getting close, and he was trying to make her small enough that she'd stop on her own before he had to do something more permanent about her. "I'll continue my work," she said. Her voice was steady enough that she was mildly proud of it. "And I'll let Mr. Ji-Hwan know you came by." Do-Yun took another step toward her. "You'll stop," he said quietly, "and you'll understand that certain things in this house stay with the people who run it." The door opened behind him. The temperature in the room changed. Not figuratively, Amara could almost feel the actual shift in the air, some quality of pressure or tension, that the room reorganized itself around without anyone asking it to. Ji-Hwan stepped in. He looked at Do-Yun. He looked at Amara. He looked at the space between them and the particular shape of what had been happening in that space, and his expression didn't change. But something behind it did something that went quiet in the specific way things go quiet before they become very loud. "Do-Yun," he said. Just the name. Nothing attached to it. Do-Yun turned. Ji-Hwan, his voice recovered smoothly. "I was just checking on our contractor's progress, making sure she had everything she needed." Ji-Hwan crossed the room. He positioned himself not dramatically, not with any theatrical aggression, simply between Do-Yun and Amara's desk, in that territory as naturally as if he'd always stood there. "Her position," Ji-Hwan said, "is wherever I decide it is." His voice was still even, still carrying that quality of controlled certainty that Amara had first heard at midnight in her office. "And where she stands in this house is not a question. That falls within your authority." Do-Yun's jaw tightened. "I was simply pointing out." "I know what you were pointing out." Ji-Hwan held his gaze. "Don't come back to this room without my presence. And if I hear that your manner toward her repeats itself," he stopped. "Let the silence do the rest of the work." Do-Yun left. He left in the composed, deliberate way of a man who needed the departure to look like a choice and not a retreat, but Amara had spent enough time studying behavior to know the difference. She watched him go, and she thought about the connection map still open on her secondary monitor, and she understood very clearly that the man who'd just left the room had come here because he knew what she was close to finding. Ji-Hwan turned to her. Something in his expression had shifted. "Sips." The composed control was still there, but beneath it was something more human, a concern she hadn't expected from a man whose reputation was built entirely on being someone you did not concern yourself with disappointing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "He's scared," Amara said. It came out flat, factual, the way she stated conclusions. "He came in here to frighten me into stopping because he already knows I'm close." Which means she turned back to her screens. "I'm closer than I thought." Ji-Hwan was quiet for a moment. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," she exhaled. "I'm used to people like that." "You shouldn't have to be." The simplicity of it surprised her. She looked at him. He met her eyes without looking away, without softening what he'd said into something more comfortable, without the social reflex of walking it back. "You shouldn't have to be used to that," he repeated. "The fact that you are doesn't make it acceptable." Amara turned back to her screens because looking at him directly felt, in that moment, like standing too close to something that could tip her off balance. And she needed her balance. She needed it more than she had since she'd walked out of her office building, into the rain, and into this world where the rules were entirely different from the ones she'd built her life around. "I found it," she said quietly. Ji-Hwan went still. She kept her eyes on the connection map. On the trail that ended where it ended, at the entity it ended at the name attached to the entity, at the man who'd just walked out of this room with controlled, composed fury, because he knew she was coming for the truth, and the truth had his name on it. "Do-Yun stole your money," she said. Ji-Hwan did not respond immediately. She turned to look at him. His face gave her nothing readable, not shock, not fury, not the shattered quality of someone betrayed by someone they'd trusted. Instead, he looked like a man who had been waiting for confirmation of something he already knew, but had needed to be sure about before he moved. "How much do you have?" he asked. "Enough." She pulled up the documentation, the chain of companies, the registration records, the transaction patterns, the connecting name that appeared once in each structure, small enough to explain away, individually, and devastating when connected. Not just the 5 million. He's been building a secondary financial infrastructure inside your operation for years. The theft was recent. The preparation wasn't. Something moved through Ji-Hwan's expression, then not the thunderous anger she might have expected, but something worse. The specific coldness of a man who had extended trust, over years and real stakes, to someone who had spent those years positioning against him. He looked at her connection map. He looked at it for a long time. "Can you freeze his access to the offshore accounts?" "Yes." "Can you do it without him knowing?" Amara looked at the structure she'd spent 48 hours mapping. "Give me tonight." Ji-Hwan looked at her. She looked back. "Then we're going to set a trap," he said. And she understood in that moment that the investigation she'd started 3 days ago in a quiet office with rain on the windows had just become something entirely different. Something that was going to require her to be present in a way she'd spent her whole life actively avoiding. Something that was going to require her to stop hiding. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, but she was already in it. And something in her, some thread she'd thought she'd cut years ago, pulled tight with a feeling she barely recognized. Not fear, not quite. Something older. Something that had been waiting under all the gray hoodies and all the years of making herself small. She pulled her notepad toward her, clicked her pen, and started planning. She worked through the night without stopping. Not because Ji-Hwan asked her to. Not because she felt obligated to the man who had essentially transported her from her own life into his without asking permission. She worked because the problem was there. And incomplete problems had always been. The one thing Amara Voss could not walk away from, not when she was 9 years old, and couldn't sleep until she'd figured out the pattern in the water stains on the ceiling of whatever room she was living in. That month, and not now, at 27, with $5 million, and a trader's financial architecture spread across 3 monitors in a stranger's house above Lake Washington. She froze Do-Yoon's access to the offshore accounts at 3:47 in the morning. Sound. It took her longer than she'd told Ji-Hwan it would, not because the technical was difficult, but because she had to do it in a way that looked like a routine systems update rather than a targeted lockout. If Do-Yoon checked his access and found it severed cleanly, he'd know someone had found him. He'd run. And running in this world probably looked like disappearing with whatever he could still reach before the door closed. So she was careful. She moved through the account architecture the way she moved through everything methodically, without rushing, anticipating 3 steps ahead what each change would look like to someone monitoring from the other side. She inserted a false system flag that would show any attempted access as a temporary server maintenance hold. Standard. Routine. The kind of thing that happened twice a month in any large financial infrastructure and nobody panicked about. When it was done, she leaned back in her chair and let out a breath that had been building for approximately 6 hours. The house was completely silent. She hadn't heard anyone move in the hallways for hours. The security personnel who came and went with the practiced visit of people whose job was to be present without being intrusive had gone quiet sometime after 2. A sound like green wood splitting, even the ambient sounds of the building, the subtle mechanical breathing of a large structure settling and cycling through its systems, had taken on that quality of deep night stillness that felt different from regular quiet. Amara looked at the connection map she'd built. At Do-Yun's name, sitting at the center of it like a spider in a web he'd spent years constructing. She thought about the look on his face when he'd stood in this room earlier. The contempt. The specific kind of dismissal that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with what she looked like, the size of her, the unfashionability of her, the whole careful architecture of invisibility she'd built around herself that men like Do-Yun read not as armor, but as confirmation that she didn't count. She thought about the fact that he'd looked at her and decided she was safe to threaten. That was his mistake. She closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a while, and she didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt tired, the kind of tired that lives below exhaustion in the bones. Ji-Hwan found her like that when he appeared in the doorway, at a few minutes past 4, already dressed, carrying 2 mugs with the unhurried movement of someone who either hadn't slept or didn't need much of it. He set one mug near her keyboard, looked at her screens. "It's done," she said. He read the false system flag she'd constructed. Quiet for a moment, and she could see him understanding what she'd done, not just the technical execution, but the reasoning behind it, the specific care she'd taken to make the lockout invisible. "He won't know," Ji-Hwan said. "Not until we want him to." Ji-Hwan pulled the chair from across the desk and sat down. He didn't look at the screens anymore. He looked at her with that directness. She was getting used to the gaze of someone who had decided she was worth looking at directly and had apparently not reconsidered that decision since they'd met. "Tell me the full scope," he said. So she told him. It took 40 minutes. She walked him through the entire map, not just the 5 million in the port accounts, but the deeper infrastructure Do-Yun had been building for years underneath it. The secondary shell network. The properties in Vancouver that technically belonged to a holding company with no visible connection to Do-Yun, but that Amara had traced back through 3 layers of registered agents. The communication patterns she'd inferred from account timing payments that went out in rhythms, suggesting coordination with external parties. Rival crews who'd been receiving information about Ji-Hwan's shipping routes, disguised as consultant fees. Ji-Hwan listened without interrupting. That was something she noticed about him, the specific quality of his attention. Most people listened the way they waited for their turn to speak, their attention wandering in the pauses, their eyes moving toward their own thoughts. Ji-Hwan listened the way she read financial records. Like he was holding every detail in parallel, tracking the connections between them, not responding until he had the whole picture and understood how each piece related to every other piece. When she finished, the silence lasted almost a minute. "He's been feeding shipping route information to the Lim crew," Ji-Hwan said. Not a question. The payment timing suggests ongoing coordination. At least 18 months, which means the 5 million wasn't the objective. His voice was completely even. She'd expected anger, some visible expression of what it meant to hear, that a man he'd trusted for years had been actively dismantling his operation from the inside. There was none. What was there instead was something colder. More considered. The money was a contingency. Something to land on when he was ready to move. That's how I read it. Ji-Hwan stood. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking at the dark surface of Lake Washington and the lights of the city beyond it. His hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not crossed, just there, open, which she somehow found more telling than any of the expressions she could have seen on his face. "How many people in my organization know you're here?" he asked. "You'd know that better than I would. Humor me." She thought about it. "The men who came to the office know. Your security staff here. Anyone Do-Yun might have told." She paused. "If he's been in contact with the Lim crew about routing information and they know an accountant is working on your port accounts, Spiste, then they know to be interested in what she finds." He turned from the window. Yes. The implication landed with the weight of something heavy dropped from height. The same danger that had made Ji-Hwan come to her office in the first place hadn't disappeared. It had gotten more specific. She hadn't just been close to finding something inconvenient, she'd found the thing that could dismantle Do-Yun's entire exit strategy. And now he knew she had it, or suspected she did, which, for a man in his position, amounted to the same problem. "He's going to move soon," Ji-Hwan said. "Yes, which means we set the trap before he does." Amara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Walk me through what you're thinking." He did. They spent the next 2 hours at that table, in the deep night quiet of the house, with the lake going gray toward dawn outside the windows, and Amara learned something about Ji-Hwan that she hadn't expected. He planned the way she analyzed. Methodically, accounting for failure modes before assuming success. Looking for the places where a strategy could break down and addressing them before committing to the strategy. She found herself arguing with him twice, not out of reflex or nerves, but because she saw vulnerabilities he hadn't accounted for, places where the plan assumed behavior that wasn't guaranteed. He listened to both objections without ego, adjusted. Asked her what she'd do differently. It was the most direct collaboration she'd had with anyone in years, and it was happening at 4 a.m. in the home of a criminal organization boss, which was not a fact she could make sense of, but which she set aside because the problem was more immediately demanding than her feelings about the context. By the time the sky started going pale, they had the shape of something. She went to sleep for 4 hours in a guest room that was nicer than any place she'd ever stayed voluntarily. A sound like green wood splitting, with a view of the lakes going silver in the early light, and the exhaustion of someone who had been operating on professional adrenaline for 3 days straight and was finally running out of it. She did not sleep peacefully. She dreamed about the car parked across the street from her office, about Do-Yun's expression when he'd looked at her clothes, about the specific quality of Ji-Hwan's gaze, which was too direct and too sustained to fit comfortably into any category she had for how men looked at her, which was mostly peripherally, if at all. She woke at 10 with the sun already high over the lake and a notification on her personal phone from a number she didn't recognize that simply said, "Thought you'd taken a vacation." Funny timing. She stared at it. Showed it to Ji-Hwan 20 minutes later in the kitchen, where he was reading something on a tablet and a member of his staff, Afterluf, was making coffee with the focused competence of someone paid to execute small tasks with large precision. Ji-Hwan looked at the message. His expression didn't change. "New phone," he said. "That was my personal number." "I know." He set down his tablet. "Leave the old phone here. We'll monitor it." Amara thought about everything on that phone. 3 years of her life contacts, messages, photos, the podcast app she'd carefully curated with episodes she hadn't listened to yet, the Notes app where she kept track of financial patterns she'd noticed that she might need someday, the small private architecture of a life she'd built carefully and quietly. She thought about the message. "Thought you'd taken a vacation." Funny timing. Someone wanted her to know they were paying attention. Someone wanted her unsettled. Someone had her personal number, which meant they'd done enough investigation to find it, which meant they'd been watching her longer than last night. She handed Ji-Hwan her old phone without saying anything else about it, because there was nothing useful to say. The situation had moved past the point where her feelings about it were relevant to the situation. He accepted it with the same gravity she offered it. The staff member brought coffee without being asked. Amara drank it and thought about what came next. What came next was Do-Yun. She didn't see him that first morning, but she felt his presence in the house, the way you feel a draft not directly, not as something visible, but as a temperature difference that tells you something somewhere is open that shouldn't be. A door closed too firmly down the hall. Voices in a room that went quiet when she passed. The way two of the security staff exchanged a look when she walked through the main corridor that she caught from the corner of her eye and filed away without reacting to. Do-Yun had been talking to people. She didn't know what he'd said. But the house had shifted around her overnight in a way that was subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed it. And Amara noticed things. It was her primary professional competency, and it did not switch off when she left a financial spreadsheet. She went back to work. She was building the second layer of the trap, the digital dead man switch, kits that would form the centerpiece of what she and Ji-Hwan had discussed when Do-Yun appeared in the doorway of the workroom at just past noon. He didn't enter this time. Stood in the frame and looked at her, and the look was different from the night before. Less contempt, more calculation. He had recalibrated, overnight adjusted from intimidation to something quieter and more dangerous. "How much have you found?" he asked. Amara kept her eyes on her screen. "You should speak to Ji-Hwan about the progress. I'm speaking to you." "That's not how this works." A pause. She could feel him deciding something. "You're smart," he said, and the way he said it made the word sound like an accusation. "Smart enough to understand that what you found has a shelf life. Financial evidence in structures like these." He paused. "It has a way of becoming ambiguous when the right people look at it." Amara stopped typing. She turned around. She looked at him directly, which she could see from his slight adjustment was not what he'd expected. "Are you threatening me?" she asked. "I'm giving you information." His voice was smooth, controlled. The voice of a man who'd had this kind of conversation before and had almost always won it. Information that might be useful to a person who's deciding how deeply they want to be involved in something that has consequences. Consequences for who? Something flickered behind his eyes. "For everyone who gets close to it," he said. Amara held his gaze for 3 full seconds. One of the things she'd learned in years of professional invisibility was that people underestimated the weight of sustained eye contact from someone they'd already decided was inconsequential. It disoriented them. It was one of the few weapons she'd kept from the arsenal of someone who'd grown up learning to read threats accurately. "I'll keep that in mind," she said and turned back to her screen. She heard him leave. Her hands were shaking again, under the desk where he couldn't see them. She put them flat on the desktop and pressed down until the shaking stopped. It took longer than she wanted. Ji-Hwan found her an hour later. She told him about the exchange before he could ask. Flat, precise, the facts in order without editorializing, because editorializing would have required her to admit how much the interaction had rattled her, and she wasn't ready to do that. Ji-Hwan listened. Then he said, "He's moving faster than I expected. He's scared. Scared men are more dangerous than angry ones." He sat on the edge of the desk across from her workstation, not her desk, the one beside it, respecting the boundary of her workspace, even in a house that was technically entirely his. "He's been making calls this morning. My people have been monitoring. He's spoken to 2 members of the shipping division and someone outside the organization." "The Lim crew? We don't know yet." The outside call was brief and from a disposable line. He looked at her. "He's accelerating his timeline, which means we need to move on the trap before he realizes we're building one." Amara looked at what she'd built on her secondary monitor. "I need another 24 hours to finish the dead man switch properly. If I rush it and he finds a technical gap, the whole thing falls apart. You have tonight." "That's not tonight," he said again. Not harshly, but with the finality of someone who'd assessed the situation and reached a conclusion that wasn't negotiable. "I know it's not what you'd choose." But his behavior this morning changed the window. Amara breathed in, breathed out, looked at the unfinished architecture on her screen, and started running the calculation of what was possible in the time available. "I'll need you to keep him occupied this evening," she said. "If he comes back in here while I'm building it, he won't." The flatness of the assurance surprised her. She looked at Ji-Hwan. "I'll handle Do-Yun," he said, and something in his voice made the statement feel less like a plan and more like a fact about the near future that had already been decided. She worked. The afternoon moved through the workroom in bars of pale autumn light that crossed her monitors and moved to the floor and disappeared while she built the most complicated financial tripwire she had ever constructed. It was technically elegant in a way she wished she had time to appreciate properly a structure that would look, to Do-Yoon's access, like a routine account consolidation flag. But that would function if he tried to access his offshore funds as a complete lockout that simultaneously triggered an automatic distribution of the evidence she'd compiled. He'd reach for the money and find the door shut, and everything behind it would start moving outward. She ate something. At some point, a plate appeared near her keyboard that she consumed without tasting while keeping her eyes on the screen. She heard voices elsewhere in the house, a conversation that escalated briefly and then went quiet. She heard footsteps in the corridor that paused outside the workroom door and then moved on. The house had a tension in it by evening that she could feel in her shoulders. Around 7, one of Ji-Hwan's security staff, a man she'd learned, was called Min-jun, who was the one who'd held the umbrella over her in the rain, and who had the air of someone who took quiet professional competence as a personal standard, knocked on the open door and stepped inside. "Mr. Seo asks if you'll join him for dinner," Min-jun said. Amara looked at her screen, at the 73% completion status of what she was building, at the gap between where she was and where she needed to be. "Tell him an hour," she said. Min-jun nodded and left without comment. She was at 91% when she finally stopped and stood up, and her back protested with specific fury of someone who had been sitting in a forward-leaning position for 9 consecutive hours. She pressed both hands into her lower back and grimaced at the ceiling. She'd been wearing the same gray hoodie for 2 days. She looked at it, at the faded cuffs, at the shape it made, hanging off her the way it was designed to hang loose, shapeless, architectural in its deliberate formlessness. She left it on. Dinner was in a room off the main hall that had windows looking toward the water and a table that could seat 12, currently set for 2. Ji-Hwan was already there, out of the formal overcoat that seemed to be his public-facing uniform, in a dark shirt and slacks, reading something on his phone that he set aside when she entered. He stood when she came in. Not performatively, it wasn't the theatrical gesture of someone making a point about manners. It was simply what he did, automatically, the way people do things that have become genuine habit rather than performance. He sat. "How close?" he asked. 90%. "I'll finish it tonight." He nodded. Didn't push. They ate without talking for a while, and Amara was grateful for it, the silence of two people who were both comfortable with silence, which was rarer than most people understood. Most people filled silence because they couldn't stand what it revealed about them. Ji-Hwan seemed to fill it only when he had something worth saying. She had come to find that quality, in the past 48 hours, more disarming than anything obviously charming would have been. "Do-Yoon requested a meeting for tomorrow morning?" Ji-Hwan said, eventually. "He told me he has concerns about the security of the financial review process, about whether an outside consultant can be trusted with the level of access she's been given." Amara set down her fork. "He's going to try to shut down the investigation," she said. "He's going to try to frame it as concern for operational security, which is reasonable enough on its surface that several people in my organization will find it credible." "Will they push back on you about it?" Ji-Hwan looked at her with something that was almost amusement, not warm amusement, the dry kind, the kind that comes from observing the predictability of human behavior at close range for many years. "They don't push back on me, but they'll have questions." Yes. He considered this. If Do-Yoon positions it correctly, he creates a moment of organizational uncertainty that he can use. People questioning the consultant's access creates political cover for his next move. He picked up his glass, which is why the trap needs to be complete and triggered before tomorrow morning's meeting. Amara heard what he was saying beneath what he was saying. "You're telling me I have tonight," she said. "I'm telling you that after tomorrow morning, the situation inside this organization may become considerably more complicated. And if Do-Yoon figures out the lockout before I finish the tripwire, he won't. You don't know. He's busy tonight. Ji-Hwan's voice was still carrying that quality of controlled certainty that she'd found both reassuring and faintly frightening since the first time she'd heard it. I've given him something to be busy with. A logistics problem in the port division that requires his direct attention and that will occupy him through most of the evening. Amara looked at him. You manufactured a problem. I managed a timeline. She almost laughed. It came out of her without permission, a short, disbelieving exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Ji-Hwan noticed it with the same attention he noticed everything, and something in his expression shifted by a fraction in a direction she couldn't name. Finish tonight, he said. Whatever you need, Min-jun can get it. She finished eating quickly, then went back to the workstation. She finished at 11:48 p.m. She sat looking at what she'd built, the completed tripwire, the evidence package wired to it, the dead man's switch that would begin a countdown the moment it was activated, and that would distribute everything automatically at midnight if she didn't enter a cancellation code. It was good work. Possibly the best work she'd ever done, which felt like an uncomfortable thing to be proud of given the context. She sent a message to Ji-Hwan's phone, done. His reply came in under 2 minutes. Tomorrow we set the stage. She looked around the workroom, at the life she'd been occupying for 3 days, someone else's space, someone else's war being fought with her specific and apparently unique skill set. She thought about her old office, the second-row desk, the emergency exit she'd mapped on day one, the life she'd built from the outside in, from invisibility outward, never inward. She thought about Do-Yoon's face when he'd looked at her clothes. She thought about Ji-Hwan saying, you shouldn't have to be used to it, with the plain certainty of someone stating an objective truth. She turned off the monitors. She went to the guest room and didn't sleep for a long time, lying on her back looking at the ceiling while the house settled around her and the lake outside moved in the dark, and she tried to organize the contents of her mind into something manageable. By morning, she'd almost succeeded. She was back at the workstation by 7, coffee in hand, the gray hoodie replaced without entirely planning to replace it with a fitted dark green sweater she'd pulled from the bag she'd had Min-jun bring from her apartment 2 days ago. She'd put it on, and then stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 30 seconds, which was 28 seconds longer than she usually spent looking at herself, before pulling it down over her hips and deciding she wasn't changing back. It was just a sweater. She was at her desk before Ji-Hwan appeared. When he did appear in the doorway, he stopped. He didn't say anything immediately. A sound like green wood splitting. He looked at her with the directness that was apparently just how he operated, and she felt it the way she'd been feeling it for 3 days, as a kind of attention that had weight to it, that pressed against the careful structure of her invisibility, without being able to locate the seams. You changed, he said. It's a sweater, Amara said, without looking away from her screen. I know what it is. She heard him come into the room. Heard him stop on the other side of the desk. She made herself finish the line of code she'd been working on before she looked up. He wasn't looking at the sweater anymore. He was looking at her face. Are you ready for today? He asked. She looked back at her screen. At the tripwire. At the bait structure they'd discussed, the false encrypted drive. The suggestion that the frozen offshore funds could be recovered through a physical key stored in the estate. The careful construction of a scenario designed to draw Do-Yoon into a position where his attempt to access the money would trigger everything simultaneously. She'd spent 3 days being afraid in layers, afraid of Ji-Hwan, afraid of Do-Yoon, afraid of the situation, afraid of being afraid. She was still afraid, but underneath it, for the first time in as long as she could remember, something else was awake. Do-Yoon's meeting with you is at 9? She asked. 9 o'clock. Then we have an hour to finish the setup. She pulled up the bait architecture on her primary monitor. Sit down. I'm going to walk you through exactly what I need you to do, and when and in what sequence, because if the timing is off by more than 20 minutes, the whole thing collapses. Ji-Hwan sat down. He looked at her, that direct, sustained look she was still learning not to deflect from. You built something tonight that most investigators couldn't build in a week, he said. I know. Then tell me what you need. She looked at him across the workstation in the pale morning light of a Seattle autumn, with the lake going silver outside the windows and the clock reading 7, 14 and Do Yun Bake somewhere in this house, sharpening whatever move he'd spent the night preparing. She held Ji-Hwan's gaze. I need you to trust me completely, she said, for the next 12 hours. Something moved through his expression, and this time she could name it, because she'd been reading people's micro-responses for 27 years, in foster homes and offices and all the spaces in between, where being invisible meant you got very good at watching. What moved through Ji-Hwan's expression was not calculation. It was decision. Done, he said. The 9 o'clock meeting happened without her. That was the plan. Ji-Hwan had been clear about it the night before Amara stays in the workroom. Door closed, visible through the glass panel to anyone walking past, but appearing to be deep in routine account work. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that looked like preparation. Just the contractor doing her job while the men in suits handled their business in the conference room down the hall. She understood the logic. She didn't like it, but she understood it. She sat at her workstation at 8:52 and pulled up a set of legitimate account reconciliation files she'd been ignoring for 2 days and made herself look like someone doing normal work. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the automatic fluency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Her eyes tracked numbers. Her brain was somewhere else entirely. The trap was set. The bait architecture was complete, a false system alert embedded in Do Yun's account monitoring feed, suggesting that the frozen offshore funds were recoverable through a physical encrypted drive stored in Ji-Hwan's private library. The alert was designed to look like a security protocol notification, the kind of thing that appeared when an account structure required manual verification to prevent automatic asset seizure. Urgent enough to demand action. Specific enough to give him a location. If Do Yun tried to access his money tonight and found the system alert, he'd come for the drive. That was the assumption the entire plan rested on. Amara looked at her screen and ran the assumption for the 47th time and found the same answer she'd found 46 times before. It held, but only if Do Yun hadn't already moved the money somewhere she hadn't mapped. Only if her account architecture was complete. Only if he was more motivated by the offshore funds than by cutting his losses and running. Only if. She heard footsteps in the corridor at 9:03 and recognized Ji-Hwan's without looking up. The particular rhythm and weight of them had become familiar in 3 days, in a way she didn't examine too closely. 2 sets of footsteps, Ji-Hwan and Do Yun. They passed the workroom without stopping. She exhaled slowly and kept typing. The conference room was far enough down the hall that she couldn't hear voices, only the occasional shift in ambient sound that told her the meeting was happening. She checked her monitoring program, the one she'd quietly installed on the estate's internal server network 2 days ago, that tracked access attempts across every account structure she'd mapped. If Do Yun tried to check his offshore access from the conference room's terminal, she'd know within 60 seconds. Nothing, she waited. At 9:34, Min Jun appeared in the doorway. She'd learned to read Min Jun's face the way she read environmental data, with the understanding that most of the significant information was in what was restrained rather than what was expressed. Right now, his face was doing the particular thing it did when something had happened that he was deciding how to frame before he opened his mouth. The meeting ended early, he said. Amara's hand stopped moving. How early? 22 minutes, she looked at him. That's not what was planned. No, he paused. Mr. Bake requested a break to review some shipping documents. He's in his office. Amara looked back at her monitoring screen. Nothing unusual in the access logs. Did he seem? He seemed, Min Jun said carefully, like a man who'd made a decision. She held that for a moment. Where's Ji-Hwan? Coming. Ji-Hwan appeared 40 seconds later, moving with the controlled velocity of someone containing something under pressure. He came into the workroom and closed the door behind him quietly, which was somehow more intense than slamming it would have been, and stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at her. He knows, Amara said. Ji-Hwan looked at her screens, at the monitoring program, at the clean access logs. He didn't say anything in the meeting that indicated it, he said. He raised his concerns about the security review. I addressed them. He accepted it. Too easily? A beat. Yes. Amara turned back to her monitoring screen. Her mind was already working backward if Du Yun knew or suspected what had he found. She'd been meticulous about the lockout. She'd been meticulous about the false alert. There was no technical gap she could identify, which meant, who else knows the full structure of the trap, she asked. Ji-Hwan frowned slightly. Yumi. Minjun knows the physical elements, his role in managing the library access tonight. No one else, no one else. She stared at her screen. There was a thread pulling at the edge of her mind. Something she'd seen in the account architecture 2 days ago that she'd filed and moved past, because it wasn't directly relevant to the main structure. A small thing, a routine-looking transaction in one of the peripheral accounts that had a timing irregularity she'd noted and not returned to. She pulled up that account. She looked at the transaction. It was dated 6 days ago. A small payment, $4,000, which in the context of the account she'd been reviewing, was noise. The kind of amount that lived under every automated threshold, that looked like a vendor payment or a consultant fee or any of 100 routine line items. It had gone to a holding company registered in Delaware. She'd seen that Delaware company before. She pulled up her full documentation. She found it in 12 seconds. The Delaware company appeared once in Ji-Hwan's legitimate holdings, a dormant entity used for a property transaction 3 years ago, and apparently inactive since. Standard enough. She'd marked it as low priority and moved on. But the $4,000 payment 6 days ago was active. It had been received and then moved, transferred out within 18 hours to a secondary account she hadn't mapped because it wasn't in the main network she'd been given access to. She followed the secondary account. Her hands had gone very still on the keyboard. She was aware of Ji-Hwan walking from across the room, and she couldn't spare the attention to acknowledge it, because the thread was unspooling fast now, and she needed to follow it before she lost it. The secondary account connected to a name, not Du Yun's name. A different name, Park Sung-ho. She didn't know that name. She searched her documentation files, 3 days of records, financial maps, cross-referenced registration transaction histories, and found Park Sung-ho appearing once, briefly, as a notary signature on a shell company registration she'd marked as a dead end because the company had been dissolved 4 years ago. She pulled the registration. She looked at the date. She looked at the notary's information. Her brain made the connection before she was ready for it. Park Sung-ho had a professional address listed on the notary registration. A law office in Bellevue. She ran that address against everything else she had. The law office appeared in one other place in her documentation. It was the registered agent address for the holding company that controlled the Vancouver properties she tied to Du Yun. She sat back. She made herself breathe. What did you find? Ji-Hwan's voice came from close behind her. He'd moved without her noticing. He was looking at her screens from over her shoulder. You hear the quality of his breathing change as he looked at what she was looking at. Someone paid $4,000 6 days ago, she said, from your legitimate holdings, to a company that connects through a law office that also appears in Do Yoon's offshore structure. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Ji-Hwan moved around to her side of the desk. He looked at the connection she'd mapped. His face was doing nothing, completely composed, completely closed, which she had learned was more significant than any expression he might have worn. 6 days ago, he said, before I was brought here. Before I knew about the 5 million, he said quietly. More to himself than to her. Whoever made this payment knew about the account review before you did. She'd looked at the connection map, at the Delaware company, at the Bellevue law office, at the bridge between Ji-Hwan's legitimate holdings and Do Yoon's offshore infrastructure. Ji-Hwan. She made herself say it directly. This payment came from inside your legitimate accounts. Not Du Yun's, yours. He said nothing. Someone with access to your legitimate holdings paid someone connected to Du Yun's network. 6 days ago, she paused. That means Du Yun has a contact inside your legitimate operation. Someone above the level of shipping division. Someone with direct account access. Ji-Hwan's jaw tightened by a fraction. Pull everything connected to that Delaware company, he said. She was already doing it. It took 40 minutes, and the picture that assembled itself across her monitors during those 40 minutes was not the picture she'd been building for 3 days. It was larger. It had different edges. It had a different shape altogether, and the shape was worse. Do-Yun hadn't been working alone. The Delaware company connected through two layers to a financial entity she'd seen referenced in the margins of Ji-Hwan's legitimate hotel holdings, a management consulting firm that appeared in operational contracts for 2 of the 3 hotel properties. The consulting firm had received payments for 3 years. Standard fees, nothing that flagged. But the principals of the consulting firm, when she pulled the registration, included a name she recognized immediately. Claire Hyun, Ji-Hwan's chief financial officer for the legitimate hospitality holdings. The woman who had authorized the $4,000 payment 6 days ago. Amara stared at Claire Hyun's name on her screen for a long moment. She thought about the structure of what she was looking at. Claire Hyun controlled the legitimate accounts. Do-Yun controlled the criminal operations. The consulting firm created a financial bridge between both sides that looked, from any individual angle, like ordinary business. They weren't working sequentially. They weren't one person's plan, with one person executing it. They were a partnership. Ji-Hwan, she said. Her voice came out flat in a way she hadn't intended. The flatness of someone who has just understood that the problem they thought they were solving was actually a significantly smaller problem than the problem they were actually inside. He was looking at Claire Hyun's name. She watched his face for the second time in 3 days absorb a betrayal, and it was no easier to watch the second time. Not because he performed any of it, he didn't. That was the thing about Ji-Hwan that she couldn't stop observing. He didn't perform his reactions. The control was real, was bone deep, was the control of someone who had needed it to survive, long enough to become the thing he was. But underneath it, in the quality of the stillness, she could see the specific weight of learning that someone you trusted had been helping dismantle you. He'd trusted Do-Yun. He'd apparently also trusted Claire Hyun. How long, he asked. The consulting firm has been active for 3 years. But she pulled up the transaction history and looked at the timing. The payments changed 18 months ago. Amount, frequency, and destination all shifted, which matches the timeline of Do-Yun's offshore siphoning. They coordinated the start. It looks that way. Claire manages the legitimate side. She controls what moves through the hotel and hospitality accounts, what gets flagged, what doesn't. Do-Yun manages the operational side. The consulting firm is the meeting point. Ji-Hwan walked to the window. He stood there for 90 seconds. Amara watched his back and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and she'd learned early that filling silence to manage her own discomfort was a habit that served her, not the person she was with. When he turned back, his face had settled into something colder. Claire is in this building, he said. Amara went still. She's here? She arrived this morning for a quarterly review. She's been here since 8 o'clock. He looked at Amara directly. She's been here while we planned, while you finished the trap. The implication landed, like something dropped from a height. If Claire Hyun had been in the building since 8 o'clock, she'd had access to the house's internal communication systems. She knew Ji-Hwan's staff. She had legitimate reason to be in any room on the property without raising concern. The monitoring program I installed on the server network, Amara said, pulling it up. Can she access the server room from where she'd normally be working during a quarterly review? Ji-Hwan didn't answer immediately. She already had the server access logs on her screen by the time he said yes. She found it in the logs at 8:47 this morning. A routine-looking diagnostic query. The kind of thing that happened in server maintenance. The kind of thing that would appear as background noise to anyone monitoring the system who didn't know exactly what to look for. But Amara knew what to look for. The diagnostic query had touched the monitoring program she'd installed. Not obviously, not directly. It had run a sweep of recently installed scripts that a legitimate diagnostic wouldn't need to run. The sweep had lasted 4 seconds and returned to normal operation. 4 seconds was enough. She found my monitoring program, Amara said. Ji-Hwan crossed the room in 5 steps. He looked at the log. She watched him understand it, the 4-second sweep, the timestamp, the implication. She knows we're watching the access logs, he said. She knows I built something. Amara's voice was steady, but her chest felt tight. She doesn't know exactly what. But she knows enough to warn Do-Yun that the trap isn't just the physical drive. She looked at Ji-Hwan. He won't come for it tonight if he knows there's a digital component he hasn't mapped. The trap they'd spent the night building had just become significantly less reliable, and they had approximately 8 hours until it was supposed to trigger. Ji-Hwan straightened. "We need to move the timeline," he said. "We can't move it without rebuilding the trigger sequence." "Then rebuild it." "Ji-Hwan, it took me all night to build it the first time with complete access and no pressure. If I rush the rebuild while Do-Yun and Claire are both active in this building, what do you need?" The question stopped her. Not because it was complex. Because it was the exact right question asked, with the exact quality of focus she needed from him in this moment. Not commands, not pressure, just direct inquiry. "What do you need?" She made herself think. If Claire had identified the monitoring program but not its full function, she'd know there was a digital tripwire, but not where it was anchored. The dead man's switch was embedded in the offshore count architecture itself, not on the estate server, not in the monitoring program. Claire's sweep wouldn't have reached it, which meant the tripwire itself was still intact. What was compromised was the triggering logic, the sequence that connected the false alert to Do-Yun's account access to the evidence distribution. If Do-Yun knew there was a digital component to the trap, he'd approach the physical bait differently. He might try to access the drive without triggering his accounts. He might send someone else for it. Amara looked at the architecture. She looked at it for 30 seconds, running scenarios, eliminating the ones that didn't hold. "I need to change the trigger," she said. "Instead of connecting to his account access, which he'll avoid if Claire warned him, I anchor it to the physical drive. Whoever picks up the drive, the moment it's moved from its location, the entire sequence triggers automatically. Regardless of who moves it, regardless of who moves it." She looked at Ji-Hwan. "Which means it has to be someone Do-Yun sends, because he'll be careful himself. He'll send a proxy, and the proxy won't know to avoid triggering it. The proxy will just be moving a drive." Ji-Hwan was quiet for a moment. "How long to rebuild the trigger?" 3 hours. Maybe 4. "You have 3. She turned back to her workstation. She started pulling the trigger architecture apart. The next 3 hours were the most technically demanding work she'd ever done. Not because any individual component was beyond her, she'd built each piece before, but because she was rebuilding under time pressure while simultaneously monitoring the server logs for any further probing from Claire's location, while tracking Do-Yun's movements through the access patterns, his normal activity left in the system, while maintaining the appearance on her visible monitors of someone doing ordinary reconciliation work, in case anyone glanced through the glass panel in the door. She was running 4 processes simultaneously, and she could feel all of them. Ji-Hwan stayed in the room. He didn't hover. He didn't interrupt. Positioned himself across the room with a tablet, reviewing something that was presumably his own crisis management, and he was simply present in the way that she registered distantly. In the part of her brain not occupied with the trigger rebuild was more stabilizing than reassuring words would have been. At 12:17 p.m., Do-Yun walked past the workroom. He didn't stop. He glanced through the glass panel in the door, a brief, assessing look, the look of someone confirming information rather than gathering it, and kept walking. She kept typing, but something in her stomach had gone cold. He'd looked at her screens, not at her face, not at the room. He'd looked at her visible monitors, the ones showing the ordinary reconciliation work, and then he'd moved on. She finished the trigger rebuild at 1:43 p.m. and ran it 4 times against simulated inputs before she was satisfied it held. She told Ji-Hwan. He nodded once. "Now we wait for tonight." "Not exactly." She turned to face him. Do-Yun looked at my screens when he walked past. I don't know what he saw, but he was checking something. And if Claire told him about the digital component this morning, and he's been in the building all day. He's been in the building all day, Ji-Hwan confirmed. Then he's been thinking since this morning about what he knows and what he doesn't. And the fact that he walked past just now and looked at my screens tells me he's moving toward a decision. She held Ji-Hwan's gaze. We need to accelerate the bait. Push the false alert into his feed tonight instead of waiting for him to find it organically. Ji-Hwan considered this. If we push it too early, he has time to prepare. If we push it too late, he moves first and we lose the window entirely. She paused. 8 o'clock tonight. The estate goes to reduce security. You take a convoy out, same as planned. I stay. He sees the alert, he sees the reduced security, and he has to decide fast. Fast is better for us than slow, because fast means he makes mistakes. Because fast means he doesn't have time to be as careful as he wants to be. Ji-Hwan stood. He buttoned his jacket 2 buttons, the composed, unhurried movement of a man preparing to do something. I'll position Min-jun. There's one more thing. She said it before she could decide not to. Claire Yun. He stopped. She's been in this building all day, Amara said. If the trap triggers tonight and Do-Yun is taken, Claire walks out of here with everything she knows about the operation, and 3 years of financial cover still intact. She looked at Ji-Hwan directly. She'll disappear before morning. Ji-Hwan's expression didn't change. I know, he said, so she has to be. Amara stopped. She thought about what she was about to say, and what it meant, and what world she was in that she was about to say it. She'll be managed, Ji-Hwan said quietly. That's not your concern. It is my concern, Amara said, because the financial evidence I've built covers Do-Yun. I haven't built the same level of documentation on Claire yet. If she moves the consulting firm's assets before tonight, build it, Ji-Hwan said. Amara turned back to her screen. She started building. The afternoon darkened toward evening outside the windows. Seattle went gray, and then grayer, and at 4:30, the rain started, not the dramatic storm she'd been imagining for the night's operation, but a steady, cold, insistent rain that had the quality of something settling in for a long stay. She had Claire Hyun's financial trail documented to the same depth as Do-Yun's by 6:15. She was wiring it into the same distribution architecture, the evidence package that would go out automatically at midnight if she didn't cancel it when her monitoring program threw an alert. She looked at the alert. Someone had accessed the estate server room at 9 p.m., not through the main terminal. Through a secondary access point used for equipment maintenance, this appeared in the server room's log as an automated diagnostic. The same cover Claire had used this morning. But this time the access hadn't lasted 4 seconds. This time it had lasted 11 minutes. Amara's hands went completely still above the keyboard. She pulled the log. She traced every query the 11-minute access had run. Sound seen. She followed them through the server architecture with the concentrated speed of someone who understands the system they're reading. Her stomach dropped. The 11-minute access had found the dead man's switch. Not the trigger mechanism that was still clean, still anchored to the physical drive, still invisible to anything that didn't know specifically what to look for. But the distribution architecture, the evidence package, the account that would receive the midnight trigger and send everything outward that had been identified. Identified and modified. Amara stared at the modification. It was subtle. It was the work of someone who understood financial system architecture at a level that matched her own, which told her something uncomfortable about Claire Hyun that she hadn't fully accounted for. The modification hadn't disabled the distribution. It had redirected it. If the trap triggered tonight, the evidence package wouldn't go to Ji-Hwan's organizational network. It would go somewhere else. She followed the redirect. It went to an external server, an IP address she didn't recognize. She ran it against what she had. The IP was to a service provider used by the Lim crew. The evidence package, the complete financial documentation of Do-Yun's theft, Claire's consulting bridge, the entire structure of the internal betrayal would be delivered directly to Ji-Hwan's rivals. Not as exposure, as a gift. The Lim crew would receive everything they needed to understand Ji-Hwan's complete financial architecture. Everything Amara had mapped, every account, every shell structure, every legitimate holding threaded through every operational account. The trap she'd built to protect Ji-Hwan's organization would hand his enemies the keys to destroying it. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then she started moving. She called out for Min-jun without getting up from her chair, loud enough that her voice carried into the hallway. He appeared in 11 seconds. Get Ji-Hwan, she said. Right now, don't tell anyone else. Min-jun looked at her face. He left immediately. She kept working. Steez. She was already isolating the redirect, trying to surgically remove Claire's modification without disrupting the rest of the architecture, which was like trying to pull one thread from a knot without tightening any of the others. Every change she made had to be verified against the full system, or she risked triggering the distribution mechanism prematurely. Ji-Hwan was in the room in under 2 minutes. She told him in 30 seconds flat. No preamble, just the facts in order. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not rage, not the cold calculation she'd come to expect. The Senese. Something rawer than either the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the situation he thought he was managing had been managing him, and that the window in which he could recover it was very small and closing. Can you fix it? He asked. I'm fixing it now. But Ji-Hwan, she kept her hands moving, even as she turned to look at him. If Claire got into the server room once, without triggering my monitoring program correctly, she can do it again. Whatever I rebuild tonight, she has access to. Then we lock her out. Locking her out tells her we found the redirect. She'll warn Do-Yun, and they both run tonight, instead of Do-Yun coming for the drive. Ji-Hwan stood still. He was running the same calculation she was. She could see it, the impossibility of the position. The way every available move had a cost that degraded the outcome. Contain Claire and lose Do-Yun. Let Claire move freely and risk losing everything. Accelerate the trap and risk triggering a half-rebuilt system that might still have vulnerabilities she hadn't found yet. What's the least bad option? He asked. It was, she thought distantly, exactly the right question for the situation they were in. Not the best option. The least bad one. She thought about it for 15 seconds, with her hands still moving across the keyboard. We can't protect the server room remotely, she said. Not if she has physical access, which means I need to physically relocate the distribution architecture off the estate server entirely. She looked at him. Onto my own equipment. Isolated. Something she can't touch remotely because it's not connected to anything she has access to. How long? An hour. Then we proceed tonight, as planned, but an hour later. 9 o'clock instead of 8. Yes, she exhaled. Turned back to her screen. She was 40 minutes into the migration, the most delicate technical work she'd ever done, moving a live system architecture from one environment to another, without breaking the internal connections when Min-Jun appeared in the doorway. His face was doing the thing. Claire Hyun, he said, is no longer in the building. Amara's hands stopped. She looked at Ji-Hwan. He was looking at Min-Jun with an expression that had gone completely flat. When? He asked. Her car left the property at 6:47, Min-Jun said. Security logged it as a normal departure. She told the gate she had a dinner appointment. Amara looked at the timestamp on her monitoring log. Claire's 11-minute server access had ended at 6:20. She'd spent 27 minutes, except 9 minutes, after finding and modifying the distribution architecture before walking out of the building. 27 minutes. Enough time to make a phone call. Amara looked at the migration in progress on her screen. At the 60% completion status, she called Do-Yun, Amara said, before she left. Yes, Ji-Hwan said, which means he knows we found the redirect. Yes, which means he's not coming for the drive tonight. Ji-Hwan looked at her. She looked back at him. The trap was gone. The architecture she'd spent 3 days building, rebuilt under pressure, restructured under greater pressure, and migrated with her hands, shaking all of it, was still technically intact. But it was aimed at a target that was no longer going to walk into range. Everything she'd built assumed Do-Yun would come to her. Now she understood that he wasn't coming, and the only way to finish this was to go to him. She sat back in her chair. The motion was controlled. Everything about her in that moment was controlled, because if she let the controls slip even slightly, she wasn't sure what would come out, and whatever it was wasn't going to help the situation. I'm the bait, she said. Ji-Hwan went still. Not the drive, she continued, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone who was saying what she was saying. Me. I'm the one who built the evidence architecture. I'm the one who can access it, modify it, cancel the distribution. He doesn't need the drive if he can get to me. She looked at Ji-Hwan directly. Claire told him what I built. She told him I'm the only one who can stop it from going out. which means I'm more valuable to him than the drive ever was. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she could hear the rain on the windows. Ji-Hwan's expression had changed into something she couldn't completely read, something that was partly a controlled calculation she'd come to expect, and partly something else. Something that pushed against the control from inside, looking for an edge. No, he said. It's the only move that still works. I said no, Ji-Hwan. She stood up. She was tired and scared, and the green sweater had a coffee stain on the cuff she'd gotten somewhere around hour 6 of building the trigger. And she was standing in a house above a lake in the rain, talking about making herself a target. And underneath all of it, underneath everything, some part of her that had been sleeping for a very long time was wide awake and absolutely certain. He's going to run if we don't give him a reason to stay. And if he runs, everything I found disappears with him. Claire disappears. 3 years of a coordinated betrayal walks out of the country, and you spend the rest of your life watching your back for people who already know everything about you. Ji-Hwan looked at her. I'm not afraid of him, she said. I know you're not, he said. That's what concerns me. She held his gaze. The rain moved against the windows, and the light in the workroom was the specific quality of evening light that made everything look slightly more real than it usually did, which was the wrong time for everything to look more real, but there it was. Tell me what you need, she said. It was the same question he'd asked her the night before. She watched him hear it. She watched him make the decision she knew he was going to make, because she'd been reading people for 27 years, and she understood the specific quality of the stillness that came before a man like Ji-Hwan committed to something. You don't move without Min-jun in position, he said. Agreed. You don't go anywhere in this building alone tonight. Agreed. And you do exactly what we plan and nothing beyond it. She looked at him. That one I can't promise. His jaw tightened. Ji-Hwan. She said his name with the same directness he always said hers. You know that's the one I can't promise. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said Min-jun. Min-jun appeared in the doorway. Get everyone in position, Ji-Hwan said. We move at 9. Amara sat back down. She finished the migration. Her hands were steady. She wasn't sure when that had happened, when the shaking had stopped, and the steadiness had come in, but it was there now, in her hands, in her spine, in the quality of her attention as she worked. Outside, the rain was getting heavier, and somewhere in Seattle, Do-yoon Baek was on a phone with a woman who had just handed him everything he needed to know about the trap waiting for him. And Amara Voss, who had spent 27 years learning to disappear, was sitting in a lit room and deciding that tonight she was going to be impossible to miss. The convoy left at 8:47. Amara watched the headlights sweep across the library wall through the tall windows, 3 vehicles moving in a deliberate procession, down the estate's main drive toward the gate, their lights catching the rain in columns before the darkness swallowed them. Ji-Hwan was in the second vehicle. That part was real. He was genuinely leaving the property, which was the one element of the trap that couldn't be faked, because Do-yoon had eyes on this estate, and both of them knew it. She'd argued about that at 8:15, standing in the hallway outside the library with the rain already loud against the roof and the clock already compressing toward the window they'd calculated. You're actually leaving, she'd said. I'm leaving the visible perimeter, Ji-Hwan said. The convoy goes to the gate. We circle back through the service road on the north property line. 18 minutes. And if something happens in 18 minutes, Min-jun is inside. He'd looked at her directly in the way she'd stopped trying to deflect from. And you're not going to let something happen in 18 minutes. It wasn't reassurance. It was an assessment of her competence, delivered as a statement of fact, and she'd found that more steadying than anything softer would have been. Now the convoy was gone, and the estate had gone quiet with the specific quality of a held breath, and Amara was alone in the library. The library was the right room. She'd chosen it 3 days ago when they'd first discussed the physical bait. It was the room with the most architectural cover, the one she knew best after spending 4 evenings working here, when the workroom felt too exposed. The one with 2 exits and sightlines she'd mapped by habit in the first hour she'd occupied it. The encrypted drive sat on the center table in a locked box whose combination only Ji-Hwan knew, which was the original bait structure, which was now secondary. The primary bait was her. She'd set the dead man's switch before the convoy left. It was running on her isolated equipment, anchored to her personal input. She needed to enter a cancellation code before midnight, or the full evidence package, Do-Yoon's financial trail, Claire's consulting bridge, the complete documentation of 3 years of coordinated betrayal distributed automatically across Ji-Hwan's organizational network and 3 external contacts she'd selected herself. She was the only person who could stop it. Do-Yun knew that now because Claire had told him, which meant she was what he was coming for. She sat at the library table with her laptop open, and her monitoring program running, and the rain getting heavier against the windows. And she did the thing she'd taught herself to do in every high-stress professional situation she'd ever been in. She made her breathing deliberate. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. Not because it made her calm, but because it made her functional, which was a different thing and the thing she actually needed. At 9:03, her monitoring program registered an access attempt on the estate's outer perimeter sensor network. Not the main gate, the east edge of the property, where the fence line ran, along a drainage easement that, on the estate's official property documentation, appeared to be a maintenance access corridor. She'd flagged that corridor 2 days ago when she'd reviewed the property layout. She'd mentioned it to Ji-Hwan. He'd said it was gated and monitored. Someone had gotten through the gate. She typed a single message to Min-jun, East Perimeter. Now his reply came in 4 seconds, confirmed. In position. She closed the message screen and looked at the library door. It was 11 minutes past 9 when the power went out. Not gradually. All at once the overhead lights, the desk lamp, the ambient glow from the corridor beyond the door. Everything. The room dropped into a darkness that was told for approximately two seconds before her eyes began adjusting, and the ambient light from the rain-washed windows began to define edges. She'd expected this. They'd discussed it. Ji-Hwan's security system had a dedicated power circuit that should have maintained partial lighting even under a main power interruption, which meant whoever had cut the power knew the property well enough to hit both circuits simultaneously. Claire's knowledge, deployed by Do-Yun's people. She reached under the table for the small tactical flashlight Min-jun had placed there at 8 o'clock. She did not turn it on. She held it in her left hand and kept her right hand on her laptop, which was running on battery, and whose screen she dimmed to its lowest visible setting. She listened. The rain was very loud. Underneath the rain, after approximately 40 seconds of silence, she heard the library door. Not the handle, she heard the door itself. The slight change in air pressure that a large door makes when it opens into a sealed room, the specific quality of sound that enters from a dark corridor into a dark room when someone is trying to be quiet about the opening and is almost, but not entirely, succeeding. She did not move. She sat at the table with her hands where she'd placed them and her breathing at 4 counts and her eyes on the darkness near the door. The man who entered was not Do-Yun. He was broad, moving low, carrying the practicance of someone who did this kind of work professionally. He swept the room with a small light that he kept angled toward the floor, checking corners, checking furniture placement, building a map of the space without illuminating himself. He was good at it. If Amara hadn't been sitting completely still in the chair she'd deliberately positioned against the darkest wall in the room, he might have done a full sweep before locating her. Instead, his light found her laptop screen. He moved toward it. She turned on the flashlight and put it directly in his face. He flinched, the automatic, uncontrollable flinch of someone whose dark-adapted eyes receive a sudden direct beam, and in the half-second of his flinch she was already standing, already moving to her, left toward the second exit, her heart slamming against her sternum with a force she could feel in her back teeth. He recovered fast, too fast. He was between her and the exit in 4 steps. She stopped. He was looking at her now with the light no longer in his eyes, and his expression was professional and cold, in the way of someone executing a task, rather than someone experiencing a confrontation. He had a gun, and he'd raised it to a position that communicated control without immediate threat. "The laptop," he said. "Tell Do-Yun to come in himself," Amara said. The man's expression didn't change. "The laptop," he said again. "The laptop doesn't help him," she said. And she was proud of How even her voice came out because her body was doing several things simultaneously that had nothing to do with evenness. The switch isn't in the laptop. It's in me. If I don't enter a code in the next, she glanced at her screen, 2 hours and 41 minutes, everything goes out. To everyone, including people he doesn't want to have it. She held the man's eyes, which your employer already knows, which is why you're here instead of a server room. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he spoke into a radio on his left shoulder. 3 words in Korean she couldn't parse. He stepped back toward the wall. He was making room. Do-Yun came through the library door. His expensive suit was soaked through, not damp. Soaked. The way you get when you've been in heavy Seattle rain for longer than an overcoat can manage. His hair was wet and flat against his head. His composure, the architectural composure she'd watched him wear like a second skin every time she'd seen him in this house, was still present but operating under visible strain, the composure of someone gripping something tightly rather than someone who simply possessed it. He looked at her. She stood beside the table with the flashlight, still in her hand, and her laptop behind her, and the darkness of the library pressing in from every direction, and she looked back at him, and she did not step away. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. "You gave me no credit," she said. Something moved through his face. He looked around the library, at the locked box on the table, at her laptop, at the single door between him and the hallway. He was running calculations the way she ran calculations, looking for the move that cost the least. "Tell me how to disable the switch," he said. "No, Miss Voss." His voice had dropped into something quiet and deliberate, the tone of someone making a final reasonable offer before the situation passed the point where reasonable offers were possible. "I understand you believe you're protected here. I understand Ji-Hwan has made you certain commitments." He paused. "Ji-Hwan isn't in the building. I know. Which means the protection he promised you isn't currently available. I know that too." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite respect, and was probably the specific irritation of someone encountering resistance they'd genuinely not prepared for. "Then you understand the position you're in." "Completely," she said. "Do you understand yours?" He went still. "You came here for the drive," she said. "Claire told you about the digital switch, so you pivoted. You're here for me instead, thinking if you can force the cancellation code, you recover the offshore Kawatsu accounts and the evidence to hers." She kept her voice flat and clear. "But Claire also told you I built the distribution architecture." "Which means she told you what it covers." She held his gaze. 3 years, Do-Yun. I have 3 years of the consulting firm, the Vancouver properties, the Lim crew payments. I have the full map." She paused. "If you force me to give you the cancellation code and nothing goes out tonight, the evidence still exists. I've still built it, and Ji-Hwan will still have it when this is over." "Ji-Hwan won't be in a position to use anything when this is over," Do-Yun said. The sentence landed with the weight of something that had been held back until it needed to be said. Amara heard it. She heard what was underneath it. "What did you do?" she said. Do-Yun was quiet. "What did you do?" Her voice had a different quality now, still controlled, but with something underneath the control that was cold and focused in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "The convoy left at 8:47, Do-Yun said. 3 vehicles. Ji-Hwan was in the second." He straightened slightly. "The service road on the north property line has been blocked since 8:30. Her chest tightened. "Blocked," she said. "An equipment vehicle. Positioned as a maintenance obstruction. Security would have logged it as routine." He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd had 18 months to plan this and had planned it comprehensively. "The convoy can circle, but it can't use the service road to come back quietly. Which means it comes back through the main gate." He paused. "Which adds 30 minutes to the return. 48 minutes from when the convoy left." She checked her internal clock. They had approximately 6 minutes left of the 18 Ji-Hwan had calculated. With the service road blocked, they had 30 minutes instead. 24 minutes in which Do-Yun had full control of this room, and she had nothing but the dead man's switch and the knowledge that Min-jun was somewhere in this building, and the specific, unshakable quality that had been growing in her for 4 days, and that she had not yet fully tested at the velocity this moment was going to require. "You planned this part," she said. I planned all of it, Du-Yun said, without the heat of someone boasting. Simply the tone of someone confirming a fact. You're exceptional at what you do. I want you to know I understand that. The trap you built was better than anything I anticipated. He moved toward the table, toward her laptop, toward the locked box, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had time now and knew it. That's why we needed Claire. Claire built your access to the server room. Claire built a great many things over 3 years. He stopped on the other side of the table from her. The man with the gun had shifted position, still covering the exit, still covering her. The cancellation code, Miss Voss. You can give it to me now, or we can spend 20 minutes negotiating toward the same result. Amara looked at him across the library table. She thought about Ji-Hwan in a convoy that couldn't come back the way it had planned. She thought about Min-jun somewhere in the dark of this house, waiting for a signal. She thought about the dead man's switch, running on her isolated equipment, counting down toward midnight, waiting for her input. She thought about a car parked across the street from her office that she'd told herself was nothing. She thought about Do-Yun looking at her clothes and deciding she was safe to dismiss. She thought about what it had felt like 4 days ago to be invisible by design, to have constructed her own smallness so thoroughly that men like this one looked directly at her and saw nothing worth accounting for. She thought about the green sweater. No, she said. Du-Yun's eyes went flat. I'm going to need you to understand something, he said, and the reasonable offer quality was gone from his voice now, replaced by something harder and more impatient. The situation you're in has one exit and I'm offering it to you. Give me the code, walk out of this room, and what happens after tonight between me and Ji-Hwan is not your problem. It became my problem, she said, when you walked into my office building. That was Ji-Hwan's choice, not mine, and this is mine. She straightened. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not as panic, not as the physical noise of fear making her small, but as the sound of something in her chest that had been quiet for a long time and had woken up and was now running at full velocity. I'm not giving you the code. He came around the table. She backed up one step, not retreat, recalibration, putting the table between her and the man with the gun, and then she stopped backing up because she'd run out of floor and found the wall. Du-Yun stopped 2 feet from her. He was taller than he looked in the composed architectural way he usually occupied space. Up close, without the suit's tailoring doing its work, he was a larger physical presence, and she was aware of that with the animal specificity of someone whose body was registering a threat it couldn't reason its way out of. Last time, he said quietly, the room changed. Not the room, the sound of the room changed. A sound like green wood splitting, and then a figure moved at the edge of her peripheral vision, and Do-Yun turned and Min-jun came through the darkness at the far end of the library, with the controlled velocity of someone who'd been waiting in position and had received the signal he was waiting for. The man with the gun turned toward Min-jun. Min-jun was already moving. What happened next was very fast and not clean, and nothing like the composed choreography Amara had always assumed violence looked like from the outside. Min-jun hit the armed man at an angle, going for the weapon hand first, a specific, targeted impact that sent the gun sideways rather than trying to overpower the whole person, which Amara registered distantly as excellent tactical thinking. And then they were both on the floor, and Do-Yun was moving toward the door. She moved before she decided to. She was between Do-Yun and the door in 4 steps, and she put both hands flat against the door frame, and she looked at him, and something in her face made him stop. She didn't know what was in her face. She couldn't see it. She only knew what was in her body, the thing that had been building for 4 days and longer, for 27 years. Every time someone had looked through her and past her, and decided, she took up too little space to matter. You're not leaving, she said. Move, Du-Yun said. No, he grabbed her arm. She felt the grip hard, meant to move her. The casual physical confidence of someone who had never had a reason to expect resistance from this particular category of person, and she pulled against it, not by trying to break the grip, but by shifting her weight in the direction he was pulling. And then stopping suddenly, using the change in his expectation to break his balance. He stumbled half a step. It wasn't a clean technique. She'd attended 2 self-defense workshops 5 years ago, and retained approximately 40% of what she'd learned. And what came out of her body in that moment was not trained response, but the ungainly, fierce, specific determination of someone who had decided they were done being moved. She got the door closed. Do-Yun caught her by the shoulder and turned her, and she hit the door frame with her shoulder blade, and the pain was bright and immediate and real in a way that clarified everything. Behind them, Min-jun and the armed man were still on the floor, the fight having migrated from standing to ground in the way fights apparently do, a sound like green wood splitting, and she could hear it, the specific sounds of two people hurting each other that she'd never heard from this close before, and that were nothing like what she'd been told they'd sound like. Do-Yun had her pressed against the doorframe and was reaching past her for the handle. She bit him. She wasn't proud of it, and she was absolutely not sorry about it. She bit the forearm, reaching past her with the complete commitment of someone who has run out of better options and has decided that whatever works, works. He pulled back with a sound that was partly pain and partly genuine surprise. She spun away from the doorframe. They faced each other in the dark library with the rain, hammering the windows and the sounds of Min-jun's confrontation behind them, and her shoulder pulsing where she'd hit the frame, and Do-Yun breathing hard through his nose with his jaw set. "You have no idea," he said, "what you've walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into." She was breathing hard. Her voice came out in pieces. "I've been mapping it for 4 days." He looked at her. She looked back. Behind her, a heavy sound. Something or someone hitting the floor with finality. Then silence from that direction. She didn't know which one had won it, and she couldn't afford to look away from Do-Yun to find out. "Last chance," she said. "Sit down." His face shifted, the composure cracking along a fault line that had apparently been there for some time and was choosing this moment to give way. He came at her, not with the controlled movement of a man executing a plan, but with the lurching momentum of someone who'd run out of plan and was operating on something more basic. She dropped. She didn't plan that either. Her knees buckled in the specific way they apparently buckle when you're 27 years old and have spent 4 days on 4 hours of sleep, and your body makes a decision your brain is still forming. She went down, and Do-Yun went over her and hit the library table, and the locked box left the table and hit the floor, and Do-Yun went down on one knee with the impact. She scrambled. She got to the table. She got her laptop. She pulled it against her chest with both arms, the way you'd hold something irreplaceable, which it was, because without it, the dead man's switch had no cancellation interface, and midnight was the unalterable end of the countdown. Do-Yun was back on his feet. She was not back on her feet. She was on the floor with the laptop, and her shoulder was genuinely hurting now, in the deep interior way that meant something had happened to it. She wasn't going to fully understand until tomorrow. And Do-Yun was 3 feet away, and between her and every exit, and Min-jun had not reappeared. She looked at her laptop screen. 2 hours, 11 minutes. She looked at Do-Yun. She thought about something Ji-Hwan had said 3 nights ago at a table with 2 coffees between them. Scared men are more dangerous than angry ones. Do-Yun was scared. She could see it now, very clearly, from the floor of a dark library with rain on every window, and her shoulder hurting, and her heart running fast and loud. The composure was entirely gone. Under it was a man who had spent 3 years building an exit from a world that would kill him if he stayed, and who was watching that exit close in real time, and who was calculating the way scared people calculate, not toward the best outcome, toward the one that feels most immediately survivable. He needed her not to survive this night. She understood that. She'd understood it since the library door had opened. She'd understood it and walked toward it anyway, because the alternative was everything she'd built, for 3 days going to people who would use it to dismantle the one man who had looked at her and seen something worth protecting. She held her laptop tighter. "The code isn't something I can give you under pressure," she said from the floor. Her voice came out more steady than it had any right to. "It's a sequence I have to enter deliberately, at a terminal with time to do it accurately. If you force me, I'll make errors. The switch will trigger anyway." She looked at him. "You need me functional. You need me willing. And I'm neither of those things from the floor." He looked at her for 3 seconds. He reached down and grabbed her arm, the good one. not the shoulder that was pulsing, and pulled her to her feet with more care than she expected, which told her the calculation had landed. She stood. She held the laptop. She faced each other from 2 feet away, and she could feel his breath, and she could feel her own heartbeat in her shoulder, and she could feel the rain on the windows and the count of the dead man's switch, and somewhere outside this house, convoy that was 30 minutes away instead of 18. Walk me through it, he said. Whatever you need to cancel it. Walk me through. She looked at him. She looked at the laptop screen. She thought about Ji-Hwan saying done that morning across the workstation with the pale light of Seattle autumn behind him and the quality of the decision visible in his face. She thought about Min-jun, who she still couldn't see. She sounded like North Property. She thought about the North Property line, where a service road had been blocked since at 8:30 by someone who'd planned this comprehensively, who had 18 months of planning behind every choice made tonight. She thought about what it meant to be the person in the room who understood the numbers. Sit down, she said, at the table. Do-Yun moved to the chair. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone tracking a variable they're not entirely sure they've controlled. She moved to the table. She set the laptop down. She looked at the screen. She looked at the door. She opened her mouth to say something she didn't know yet. What? Some version of the calculation that had been running underneath everything else for the past 20 minutes. Some move she hadn't shown him yet. The library door opened. Do-Yun was on his feet before the door was fully open, turning fast with the instinct of someone who'd been expecting this and had a plan for it. The plan didn't account for Ji-Hwan. He came through the door fast and low, and without the composed, contained movement he used when he was in control of a situation. This was something rawer, something that had burned through the control, something that had apparently been building during 30 minutes in a stopped convoy on the North Property line, with the knowledge that she was alone in this building. He hit Do-Yun before Do-Yun fully turned. The impact drove both men into the heavy bookcase along the east wall, and the bookcase didn't give, and they didn't give, and what resulted was not the clean, efficient violence Amara had imagined from someone with Ji-Hwan's capabilities, but something brutal and close and powered by something that wasn't tactical. She pressed herself against the table. She watched. Do-Yun was fighting, not the controlled fighting of someone executing a plan, but the desperate fighting of someone who understood what was at stake and had nothing left to manage with. He landed something on Ji-Hwan's jaw that snapped his head back and gave Do-Yun a half-second of space, and he used it to go for the door. Ji-Hwan caught his collar. The catch brought Do-Yun back hard, drove him into the table edge, the other side of the table from Amara. The table shuddering between them and Ji-Hwan's forearm came down across Do-Yun's back, and Do-Yun went to his knees. He didn't stay there. He came back up with something from his jacket, something small, something that caught the faint window light for a fraction of a second before Amara's brain identified it as a knife. Ji-Hwan, he'd already seen it. He stepped inside the arc instead of away from it, the specific, committed movement of someone who understands that the only safe place from a blade is the place where it can't reach, and the knife went wide, and Ji-Hwan's hand closed around Do-Yun's wrist and torqued. And the sound Do-Yun made was short and involuntary. The knife hit the floor. They were against the bookcase again. Ji-Hwan's forearm across Do-Yun's throat, and the bookcase was taking the weight of both of them, and something had fallen from the shelves, somewhere in the struggle, and Do-Yun's hands were at Ji-Hwan's arm, trying to get purchase, trying to create space, finding none. His legs buckled. Ji-Hwan held him until he stopped fighting, and then for 3 seconds after, which was the specific extra time of a man making sure and not assuming. Then he stepped back. Do-Yun slid down the bookcase to the floor. He was conscious, breathing hard, hands at his throat, not moving. The fight was completely out of him in the way it leaves a person, not gradually, but all at once, like a light turned off. Ji-Hwan stepped back. He looked at his hands. He looked at the room, the overturned locked box, the laptop on the table, the knife on the floor, the wreckage of the bookcase. He looked at Amara. She was still standing at the table. She still had both hands on her laptop. She was breathing in the deliberate 4-count way, and it was not working as well as it had been working earlier, and she was aware of every separate piece of damage her body had taken in the last 20 minutes, and she was looking at Ji-Hwan with an expression she couldn't organize, because there were too many things in it. He crossed to her. He was bleeding from somewhere near his jaw, not much, a cut, the kind of thing that happens when two people hit a bookcase at speed, and the bookcase wins points on the exchange. He reached up and checked her shoulder with one hand, the injured one, his fingers finding the place that was wrong, without her telling him where it was. She flinched. "It's not dislocated," he said, more to himself than to her. "But it needs ice." "Later," she said. He looked at her face. "Later," he agreed. Behind him, the library door opened again, and two members of Ji-Hwan's security came through, moving to Do-Yun without being directed, with the professional efficiency of people executing a plan that had been in place for longer than tonight. Min-jun appeared from the far end of the library. He was moving with a slight favoritism of his left side that told its own story about what had happened on the floor in the dark. He looked at Do-Yun. He looked at Ji-Hwan. He looked at Amara with an expression that she read as something between professional relief and a kind of restrained, genuine concern. "The other man?" Ji-Hwan asked him. "Contained," Min-jun said. "Claire-hyun, we have a location." She didn't go far. Min-jun paused. She was waiting for a call that apparently didn't come. Do-Yun on the floor made a sound that wasn't words. Everyone in the room looked at him. He was looking at Ji-Hwan with the expression of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, the exact nature of the miscalculation he made and cannot unknow it now that he knows it. 18 months, Ji-Hwan said. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't performing anything. His voice had the quality of something very final. 18 months of my routes going to the Lim crew. 18 months of Claire moving money through your consulting structure. He looked at Do-Yun for a long moment. And $5 million from men who trusted you because I trusted you. Do-Yun didn't speak. The men whose roots you sold, Ji-Hwan continued, still in that quiet, final voice. 3 of them are dead. Did you know that? 2 from the Lim crew's action on the Tacoma line last spring. A sound one from a cargo dispute in Vancouver that wouldn't have happened if the route information had stayed where it was supposed to stay. Do-Yun's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Yes, Ji-Hwan said. You knew. The security team lifted Do-Yun from the floor. He didn't resist. The resistance was entirely gone, in the specific way of a man who has spent everything he had on one outcome and lost, and has nothing left to spend on anything. They moved him toward the door. Amara watched him go. She felt something watching him, not satisfaction, which she'd expected, but that specific flatness that comes after something very large, has been resolved, and the body hasn't processed it yet. The absence of the thing that's been taking up space. The first breath in a week that doesn't have something pressing against it. The door closed. She and Ji-Hwan were alone in the library. The rain was still loud. The lights were still out. The pale window light made everything look like something preserved in time-stamped in amber, time-stop belonging to a moment that would be hard to exclude later, because it had too many pieces. She looked at her laptop. 1 hour, 58 minutes on the dead man's switch. She entered the cancellation code. The counter stopped. She let out a breath. Ji-Hwan was watching her. The service road, she said. We came back through the front gate. He paused. It took longer. I know, she looked at him. I handled it. Something moved in his face. The same thing she'd seen that morning when she'd asked him to trust her completely for 12 hours. And he'd said done with the quality of a decision rather than an assurance. Yes, he said. You did. She looked at the knife on the floor. At the overturned locked box. At the place by the bookcase where Do-Yun had been. She looked at Ji-Hwan's jaw, where the cut was already darkening toward something that would look worse tomorrow. Ice, she said. He looked at her. You said my shoulder needs ice, she said. Yours does too. He was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before, something that was not the calculation, not the controlled certainty, not the contained authority she'd been reading for 4 days. Something that lived below all of those things and was quieter and considerably more human. Come on, he said. She picked up her laptop. She followed him out of the library, through the dark corridor, toward the kitchen, where Min-jun was already moving, with the focused efficiency of someone locating ice packs. And the rain kept hammering the windows of a house, where, somewhere in a sealed room, a man who had spent 18 months dismantling something was now accounting for it. And the woman who had built the case against him walked through the dark with a cut on her knee she hadn't noticed until now, and a shoulder that would remind her of this night for 2 weeks, and an expression on her face that's she couldn't organize because it had too many pieces. But underneath all the pieces, something clear, something that had been coming for 4 days and had finally arrived. She was still standing. And somewhere in that fact was everything she needed to understand about who she had always been, under all the gray hoodies and all the careful construction of her own invisibility, waiting for a night exactly like this one to make itself known. The ice pack was wrapped in a dish towel, and it was not enough for either of them. Min Jun had located 2 in the kitchen freezer and distributed them without ceremony, one to Amara's shoulder, one toward Ji-Hwan's jaw, and then positioned himself near the kitchen door with the professional discretion of someone who understood that the people in the room needed to be in it without an audience, while simultaneously not being anywhere else in case they needed him. Amara sat on the kitchen counter. She'd gotten up there without thinking about it, hoisted herself onto the surface when she was tired, the way she did in her own apartment, and the chairs felt too formal for the state she was in. She noticed she'd done it about 3 seconds after, and then she left herself there because coming down and finding a chair felt like more effort than it was worth, and her shoulder was doing something persistent and unpleasant, and she was tired in a way that had moved past the range where language covered it accurately. Ji-Hwan stood at the kitchen island, holding the dish towel to his jaw. He was looking at the window, at the rain which hadn't let up, at the dark surface of the lake beyond the glass, which was invisible now under the cloud cover, but present the way large bodies of water are always present, a quality of weight in the air. Neither of them spoke for almost 4 minutes. That was something Amara had come to understand about Ji-Hwan over the past 4 days, that the silences between them were not the silences of people who had run out of things to say, but the silences of people who were saving words for when they were ready to mean them. It was a quality she hadn't known she valued until she encountered it in someone else, because she'd spent most of her life in environments where silence was filled automatically, reflexively, defensively, by anyone who couldn't stand what it exposed. "Claire is in custody," Min Jun said from the doorway. Ji-Hwan took the dish towel from his jaw and looked at it. "Where?" The team found her at a hotel in Belltown. She hadn't left the city. Min Jun paused. She had a bag packed. She was waiting for the confirmation call. Do-Yoon's call, Amara said. Yes, which never came, because Do-Yoon had been on the floor of a dark library by the time it was supposed to come, and Claire had been in a hotel room in Belltown, doing the specific math of someone who understands their situation if Tushin has shifted, without being told exactly how, while the rain hit the windows and the phone didn't ring. Amara looked at the ice pack on her shoulder, at the dish towel, which had a small embroidered design in the corner, a geometric pattern, functional and undecorative, the kind of thing that got bought in bulk for a large household, and that nobody chose personally. Small domestic detail in the middle of a night that had contained almost nothing domestic. "What happens to her?" Amara asked. Ji-Hwan looked at her. "That's being handled. I know it's being handled. I'm asking what that means." He regarded her for a moment. "It means she won't be in a position to use what she knows, or what she built." Amara sat with that. She thought about Claire Hyun, the woman she'd never met, whose name she'd found in the margins of a shell company registration, and who had spent 3 years building a financial bridge between 2 sides of a betrayal with the competence of someone who was genuinely excellent at her work. She thought about what it meant to be excellent at something, and to use that excellence in a direction that pointed at other people's destruction. See it. She thought about what she might have become in different circumstances if the thing she was good at had been recruited by someone like Do-Yoon instead of noticed by someone like Ji-Hwan. She set the ice pack down on the counter. "The evidence I built covers her completely," she said. "The consulting firm payments, the server access logs, the redirect she put in the distribution architecture. All of it is documented to the same standard as Do Yoon's material. She looked at Ji-Hwan. If you want to make this clean, legally clean, the kind of clean that doesn't leave anything exposed, later you hand what I built to the right people. Ji-Hwan said nothing. I know that's not how your world works, she said. I'm not naive about that, but I'm telling you what I built, and I'm telling you it's solid enough to stand in a room with lawyers and prosecutors and come out on the other side intact. She held his gaze. What you do with that is your decision. You're advising me, he said. I'm telling you what your options are. That's what you brought me here to do. Something moved through his face, not amusement. The thing that lived adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who has said one thing and found it producing a consequence he hadn't fully anticipated, and is deciding whether the consequence is a problem or not. Your options, he said. Yes, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Min-jun. Get Cho on the phone. Min-jun nodded and stepped out. Amara looked at the window. At the rain. Who's Cho, an attorney? Ji-Hwan set the dish towel on the island. One who understands complexity. She turned that over. You're going to use the documentation. I'm going to use what you built, he said. The way you built it to be used. He met her eyes. That was the point, wasn't it? You built it to be irrefutable. Yes, then let it be irrefutable. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant, the specific cascade of events that would follow, the legal complexity, the organizational exposure that came with surfacing this material in any formal context, the ways it could circle back and complicate things. Ji-Hwan hadn't asked to have complicated. She also thought about 3 men dead on a Tacoma shipping line because someone had sold their routes. Okay, she said. It was barely a word. It cost almost nothing to say. But underneath it was the specific weight of someone who has been operating in a crisis for 4 days and has just taken one step toward what comes after the crisis, which is always harder to navigate than the crisis itself, because the crisis at least tells you exactly what to do with every minute. The next 3 hours were logistical. Min-jun returned with Ji-Hwan's attorney on the phone, and then, an hour later, in person, a Korean-American woman in her 50s named Margaret Cho, who arrived at the estate in the rain at 11:45 with a briefcase and the unhurried, assessing manner of someone who had been called to complicated situations at late hours before and had long since stopped being alarmed by them. She looked at Amara's documentation for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "This is thorough." "Yes," Amara said. "The server access logs will need authentication from the estate's system administrator. I can walk you through the authentication process. The logs are time-stamped and unmodified. I can demonstrate chain of custody." Margaret Cho looked at her over the documentation. "You built this in 4 days. I had good source material." Something crossed the attorney's face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to professional respect. She turned to Ji-Hwan. "This is usable. Do Yoon's material is comprehensive enough that the offshore recovery alone gives us the financial fraud angle. Claire's consulting structure adds the conspiracy charge." She paused. "There will be questions about how this investigation was initiated. The firm retained by my legitimate holdings to review import accounts," Ji-Hwan said. "Miss Voss was working that review." "Which is accurate," Amara said. Margaret Cho looked between them. "The sequence of events," she said carefully, "that moved the review from the accounting firm to this locations is something we can discuss," Ji-Hwan said, "in a context that isn't 11:45 at night." The attorney accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had learned that certain questions best approached from multiple angles over multiple conversations. She stayed until 2 in the morning, working through the documentation with Amara, while Ji-Hwan managed the rest of the night's operational fallout, the dismantling of Do Yoon's network of collaborators, the recovery of the offshore accounts, the specific quiet efficiency of an organization closing around a wound. At 2:15, Margaret Cho packed her briefcase and stood. "I'll need copies of everything," she said to Amara. "I'll have them prepared by morning." The attorney looked at her one more time, the comprehensive, professional assessment of one technically excellent person taking the measure of another. "You should consider consulting work," she said. "Independent. Your documentation standards are better than most investigators I work with." She left. The house went quiet in the specific way of a place from which something large has departed, not empty, but less pressurized. The security staff moved through the corridors with the reduced urgency of people whose crisis task had become a maintenance task. The rain had started, finally, to lighten. Amara sat at the kitchen table. She'd moved from the counter to the table somewhere around midnight and hadn't moved since. Her laptop was in front of her, closed now. Her shoulder had settled into the kind of deep bone-level ache that she understood was going to be significantly worse in the morning than it was tonight. She was still wearing the green sweater. It had a tear at the left cuff now from the doorframe, a small, clean rip that she'd noticed around 1 o'clock. She'd looked at it for a moment and then left it, because fixing it wasn't the priority and might not ever be the priority, and she'd spent enough of her life performing the maintenance required to look like someone who hadn't been through things. Ji-Hwan came into the kitchen at 2:40. He'd changed at some point, the soaked suit replaced with something darker and less formal, the cut on his jaw cleaned and closed, with a small adhesive bandage that was the most ordinary object she'd seen on his person since the night she'd met him. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not depleted, he didn't have the quality of someone running on empty. More the specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has just released the grip. He sat across from her. He looked at her closed laptop, at the tear in her cuff, at her face. She looked back. "Do-Yun will be transferred in the morning," he said. "To who?" "People with the appropriate jurisdiction." He held her gaze. "Your documentation will be part of what they receive." She understood what that meant, the specific architecture of how organizations like his interfaced with accountability, which was not always the architecture she'd have chosen, but which was more than she'd expected, and which, paired with what Margaret Cho was building, was enough to be something real. And Claire, same pause. She's cooperating. Amara looked at the table. She thought about cooperation, what it looked like from the inside of it, the specific calculation of someone deciding that the cost of silence had passed the cost of disclosure. She thought about the 11-minute server access, the redirect, the 18 months of the consulting firm, the 3 years of building something designed to hollow out a structure from the inside. She thought about what it cost to do that. Not practically. What it cost in the interior sense, the ongoing expense of maintaining a betrayal over time, of sitting across from someone you were actively dismantling and meeting their eyes and performing trust. She didn't think she could do it. She'd spent her life performing invisibility, which was its own kind of ongoing cost. But that was different. That was armor she'd worn against the world, not a weapon she'd aimed at a specific person. "What do you do now?" she asked the organization. Ji-Hwan was quiet for a moment. "Rebuild what was compromised. Remove what can't be rebuilt." He looked at his hands on the table, those hands she'd noticed the first night, not soft, not manicured, the hands of someone who'd earned what he had. Do-Yun knew the shipping operations better than anyone. Claire knew the legitimate financial structure better than anyone. What they took when they left is expertise, knowledge, he paused. That's harder to replace than money. But you'll replace it. Yes. How long? A year? Maybe more. She looked at him. That's a long time to be exposed, yes. He met her eyes. Which is why I need someone who understands both sides of the structure. The operational and the legitimate. Someone who can see where they interface and where they create vulnerability. He held her gaze. Someone who built a complete map of this organization in 4 days from the outside and would now know it better from the inside. Amara sat very still. She heard what he was offering. She heard every piece of what it would mean to accept it. "No," she said. Ji-Hwan waited. "That's not." She stopped. She chose her words with the care of someone who understood that what she was about to say mattered and that saying it wrong would lose something she didn't want to lose. "Whatever I do from here, it has to be mine. Not built inside someone else's structure. Not dependent on someone else's permissions." She looked at him directly. "That's not about you. That's about who I need to be." "I know," he said. "You know, I've been watching you for 4 days," he said. "You don't belong inside anyone else's organization. You belong to whatever you build. He paused. I was making a different offer. She looked at him. My legitimate holdings need an independent forensic firm. One with the expertise to understand complex organizational structures. One that can operate with the kind of access that allows genuine review rather than surface auditing. He held her gaze. An outside firm under contract on your terms. No integration. No internal position. You work for yourself, and you take my legitimate operations as a client. Amara looked at him for a long moment. That's a very different offer, she said. Yes. You'd be my client, one of several, presumably. Once you establish yourself, she thought about Margaret Cho's briefcase. About the attorney's voice saying you should consider consulting work, independent. About the documentation she'd built in 4 days that was, she knew with the unsentimentality of someone who assesses things accurately, better than most of what passed for forensic financial investigation in the legitimate professional world. She thought about the second-row desk at Halcott and Pierce. About the emergency exit she'd mapped on day 1. About 3 years of sitting in the back of every room and eating lunch alone and arriving early and leaving late so she didn't have to be in the hallway where people looked at her. She thought about the green sweater with the torn cuff. I'll think about it, she said. Ji-Hwan nodded. She looked at the window. The rain was definitively lighter, now still present, but without the hammering intensity of the earlier hours, settling into the steady, patient Seattle rain that wasn't dramatic about itself, but intended to last. I want to go home, she said. Tomorrow. I want to go back to my apartment and sit in it for a while, before I decide anything. Of course. And I want my old phone back, or the data from it. We'll get you a new phone with everything transferred. And I want, she stopped. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the 2:40 quiet of a house that had been through a great deal in the past several hours, and she felt the specific difficulty of saying the next thing, which was not a professional request, and which she'd been composing and discarding for approximately the last hour. I want to know that what happened in the past 4 days was something. Not just, she gestured vaguely, which was not her most articulate moment, but which covered the territory. Not just a contractor and a client. Ji-Hwan looked at her. He didn't look away. It was something, he said. Not quickly, not with the smooth ease of someone telling someone what they needed to hear. With the weight of someone saying something they'd decided was true and were prepared to have mean what it meant. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. She got up from the table and went to the guest room and slept for 9 hours straight, dreamlessly, which was the most complete rest she'd had in 2 weeks. She left the estate the next morning at 11. Min Jun drove her. Splitting. He didn't make conversation, which she appreciated, and when they pulled up in front of her building in Capitol Hill, he carried her bag to the door with the same quiet, competent attention he brought to everything, and she thanked him in the specific, direct way she'd learned. Was the register in which he received things best without elaboration, without performance. He nodded, got back in the car, drove away. She stood in front of her building for a moment. It was a gray Seattle morning, the kind that comes after a storm has exhausted itself and left everything clean and very slightly new-looking. The sidewalk was wet. A coffee shop across the street had its lights on, and somebody inside was writing something in a notebook. A woman with a dog walked past without looking at her. Ordinary. She'd been afraid, somewhere in the back of her mind, that ordinary would feel wrong after the past 4 days. That she'd step back into her life and find the fit had changed. She walked into her building and took the elevator to the 4th floor and unlocked her apartment door and stood in the doorway. It was the same. Her books in the shelves she'd built herself from boards and brackets because she'd had more books than furniture budget for most of her adult life. A sound like kitchen table with the scratch on one corner from the move-in, the scratch she'd covered with a folded piece of paper that she'd never replaced with something better because the paper worked fine. Her plant on the windowsill, a pothos that had survived her irregular watering habits through sheer constitutional stubbornness. She walked in and closed the door. She put her bag down. She went to the windowsill and touched the pothos's leaves alive, slightly dry, but alive, and then she went to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and stood at the window, drinking it, looking at the street below. She thought about the second-row desk. She thought about it for a while. Then she went to her laptop and opened a new document and started writing. It took her 3 days. Not the work itself, the decision took one afternoon. Sitting at her kitchen table, with the pothos on the windowsill, and the scratch on the corner, and the ordinary sounds of her building moving around her. The work took 3 days, the business structure documentation, the service framework. The client criteria she spent longer than she expected on, because she understood that who she worked for was going to define what the work became. She called it Voss Forensic Intelligence. She told no one until it existed. Not Ji-Hwan, not Margaret Cho, not the 3 former colleagues from Halcott and Pierce who texted her in the week after her absence asking if everything was okay, which she answered briefly and truthfully, as yes, I needed some time, talk soon. She built it in private, the way she'd always done her best work alone, without an audience, without the performance anxiety that came from being watched before the thing was ready to be seen. A sound like greed stirred the business. On the 4th day, she registered the business. On the 7th day, she signed a lease on a small office in a building in First Hill, not the International District, not the neighborhood where all of this had started, but adjacent to it, close enough that on a clear day, she could see the port from the corner of her office window, and that felt, she decided, exactly right. She called Ji-Hwan on the 8th day. He picked up on the 2nd ring, which she registered as something, though she didn't spend time categorizing it. I'm ready to discuss the contract, she said. A beat. When? Friday, my office. She gave him the address. I'll be there. He came on Friday with Minjun and without the formal overcoat, which she noticed. He wore a dark jacket, and he looked at her office, at the desk she'd chosen, at the shelving she'd already filled with reference materials, at the corner window with its partial view of the port, with the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything, taking stock without commenting. She sat across from him at the desk. She dressed that morning without thinking about it, without the habitual calculation of what would make her least visible, what would create least opportunity for comment. She'd put on tailored gray trousers and a fitted wine-colored top, and she'd looked in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm she'd put her clothes on correctly, and then she'd left. She was aware, sitting across from Ji-Hwan now, that she looked like herself. Not the self she'd been performing for 3 years at Halcott and Pierce. Not the armor version, the disappearing version. Just herself, in an office she'd built, across from a man she'd chosen to be in the room with. She put the contract on the desk. These are my terms, she said. Ji-Hwan picked it up. He read it. He was a thorough reader. She'd known that about him from the first morning in the workroom when he'd looked at her account maps and read them the way she read them, holding multiple layers in parallel. He read the contract the same way. He turned a page. He read the section on audit authority, the terms that gave Voss Forensic Intelligence the right to flag concerns outside the scope of any individual engagement. The section she'd deliberated over longest, because it was the section that would either make this workable or make it impossible. He set the contract down. This clause, he said, pointing to the audit authority section, gives you the right to withdraw from any engagement where you identify material, that you determine conflicts with your professional obligations. Yes, without penalty, yes. He looked at her. You're telling me that if you find something in my legitimate holdings that you determine I shouldn't be doing, you'll tell me and walk away. I'm telling you that my professional integrity is not something I include in any contract. The silence that followed was short and complete. Add a 90-day notice provision for withdrawal, he said. Not for penalty, for transition, continuity of the audit process. She looked at the clause. 60 days, she said. 90 gives you too much leverage over my exit. Ji-Hwan looked at her across the desk. Something moved through his expression that she had recognized. She understood now from the second night in the workroom when she'd disagreed with his plan and he'd adjusted without ego. It was the expression of a man who respected being pushed back on, not because he was accustomed to it, but because he was accustomed to the cost of its absence. 60 days, he said. She amended the clause. She slid the contract back across the desk. He signed it. She signed it. She took her copy and put it in the folder she'd prepared, and set the folder in the filing system she'd organized on Monday, because the filing system existed and was ready before the first client was. which was how she operated and which she was no longer interested in explaining or apologizing for. "There's one more thing," she said. Ji-Hwan waited. "Do-Yun." She folded her hands on the desk. "I know you told me it was handled. I know the legal process is what it is, and I understand the parameters around it." She looked at him directly. "I want to know that the men whose shipping routes he sold, the ones who died on that Tacoma line, their families received something. Not from the legal process. Separately." Ji-Hwan looked at her. "They did," he said. She held his gaze. "Before last week," he said. "When I understood the scope of what the Lim crew had used." He didn't look away. "I take care of the people who are damaged by what happens inside my world." She sat with that. "Okay," she said. It wasn't absolution. She wasn't in the business of absolution, and she didn't pretend to be. But it was something, the specific something of understanding that the man across the desk from her, whose world was complicated in ways she wasn't going to spend her life simplifying, he had a reckoning with his own ledger that he conducted privately and continuously. That was enough to know. She stood. He stood. She walked him to the door of the office, and Min-jun, who had waited in the hallway with his customary professional invisibility, came to attention and then relaxed when he saw both of them. Ji-Hwan stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, the full, direct, sustained look that she had stopped deflecting from at some point in the past 2 weeks, and that she now recognized as simply how he saw things, completely, without the social softening that most people applied to their attention in order to make it easier for both parties. "Your office suits you," he said. "I know," she said. "I picked it." Something in his face, the thing adjacent to amusement, the quiet thing. "Friday," he said. "There's a dinner, not business." He paused. "If you want." She looked at him. Sans. She thought about all the reasons that were complicated, and all the ways it was not straightforward, and all the history of the past 2 weeks that sat between them like furniture in a room you were learning to navigate. She thought about the night in the wood splitting, and the table between them, and the way he'd positioned himself without drama between her and Dun on the first evening, the simple, physical fact of it, unremarked upon. She thought about Dun, set across a workstation with the quality of a decision. "What time?" she said. 7. "I'll be there at 7. He left. She went back to her desk. She sat down and opened her laptop and pulled up the first working document of the Halcott and Pierce audit review. She was finalizing for the transition the legitimate professional work she'd been doing before everything began. Work that now needed to be handed off cleanly, because she was no longer that firm's employee and her professional standards didn't allow for unfinished obligations regardless of how the relationship had ended. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. At 5 o'clock, she stood up and went to the corner window and looked out at First Hill in the early winter light. The days were short now, full dark. By 4:30, the city lit up before the evening had properly started. The whole geography of Seattle doing the thing it did in winter, where the rain and the darkness compressed everything inward and made the lit windows of buildings look more significant than they did in summer. She could see a piece of the port from this window. Not much a wedge of water, the edge of a crane, the running lights of something large and slow moving through the shipping channel. But enough. The piece of the city she'd spent 2 weeks inside, following money through its infrastructure, understanding its architecture from the inside out. She'd built something here, not just the business that was 3 weeks of paperwork and decisions. She'd built something in herself. In the 4 days, in a house above a lake, where she'd stayed at a terminal until 4 in the morning and argued with a man who listened and been threatened by a man who didn't, and made herself bait for a trap she wasn't sure would work and stayed. Standing in a dark library when every instinct, built from 27 years of training herself to disappear, was telling her to become small. She hadn't become small. She'd become, in fact, precisely as large as she actually was, which was something she was still learning the shape of. She picked up her bag. She turned off the lights. She locked the office door behind her, her key, her lock, her name on the lease, and went down to the street and walked to her car in the early winter dark. She drove home with the radio off, not because the silence was comfortable, it was, mostly but because she wasn't done thinking, and music interrupted the specific quality of thought she was in the middle of. She thought about the woman who'd sat at a second-row desk for 3 years mapping emergency exits out of habit and eating lunch alone and wearing other people's ideas of what she should look like. She thought about what had changed. Not Ji-Hwan. That was the thing she needed to be precise about, and she was precise about things by nature and by practice. Ji-Hwan had not changed her. Ji-Hwan had walked into a room where she was already the most capable person present, recognized that fact, and declined to pretend otherwise. That was rarer than it should have been. But it wasn't transformation. She had transformed nothing about herself in two weeks. She just stopped agreeing with the people who'd been trying to convince her for 27 years that her natural size was an imposition. She pulled into her building's parking structure. She sat in the car for a moment, with the engine off. She thought about Friday, about 7 o'clock, about a man who'd signed a contract on her terms and said 60 days without resentment, and looked at her office with the attention of someone who understood that the object in question mattered to the person who'd made it. About sitting beside someone rather than behind them or under them or inside their structure, without a way to leave that was hers to choose. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She watered the pothos and made herself dinner, and read for 2 hours and went to sleep at 10:30 with the window open a crack, because she liked the sound of the rain, and she was no longer in a situation where the rain was anything other than rain. She slept well. 3 months later, the morning that Voss Forensic Intelligence officially opened its second office in the Cascade building, Amara stood at the window with her first coffee and watched the city coming awake in the winter light. The second office was larger than the first, a choice she'd resisted for longer than was probably rational, because larger felt like a statement she wasn't sure she'd earned yet, and she was working on distinguishing between earned caution and habitual smallness, which was ongoing work and not linear. She'd signed the lease on a Tuesday, looked at the square footage number, felt the old reflex of "is this too much?" And then she'd looked at the contract with Ji-Hwan's signature on it, and the 2 other client contracts in her filing system, and the 4th client negotiation currently in progress, and she'd decided that the square footage was not too much. She was standing at the window in an emerald green suit, tailored, fitted, made for her body instead of around it. She'd bought it 3 weeks ago, from a woman in a small shop in the CD who'd taken one look at her and her measurement, and her complete absence of interest in looking like anyone other than herself, and had made something that was exactly that. It was the same green as the sweater with the torn cuff. The sweater was in her apartment closet, still torn. She'd kept it. She didn't intend to fix it. She heard the office door behind her. Ji-Hwan came in, carrying 2 coffees, which was a habit they'd developed over the past 3 months in a way that was unremarkable and daily, and therefore more significant than anything dramatic would have been. He stopped when he saw her, stopped in the specific way he'd stopped the first morning she'd worn the green sweater in the workroom above Lake Washington. A sound like green wood splitting, the stillness of someone who has encountered something they weren't expecting and are taking a moment to be accurate about what they're seeing. "You're staring," she said. "I've been staring since the night I walked into that office." He crossed the room and handed her a coffee. It hasn't become less relevant. She took the cup. She looked at the city. The Voss Forensic Intelligence letterhead on the desk behind her. The client files in the cabinet she'd organized herself. The window with the view of the port and the water and the winter light coming across the sound. "You thought you found me," she said. He stood beside her. Not slightly behind, not slightly ahead. Beside. "I found exactly what I was looking for," he said. "Which wasn't you. I found the money." He looked at the city with her. "You were the part I didn't account for." She considered that. "That sounds like a criticism." "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Everything I planned that week, the confrontation, the trap, the timeline I ran, every scenario except the one where the most dangerous person in the situation turned out to be the woman I'd brought in to solve an accounting problem." "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "Dangerous is relative." "You built a case that dismantled 18 months of planning in 4 days." He looked at her. "And then you stood in a dark room with a man pointing a gun at you, and you didn't cancel the switch." "I considered it," she said, which was true. "I know," he said it without judgment. "That's what I mean." She looked at the port, at the crane she could see from this window, at the running lights of something large and slow in the shipping channel that was doing the same thing it had been doing. The evening she'd first seen it from her first office, moving cargo through the infrastructure of a city that never entirely stopped, regardless of what happened on shore. I found myself, she said quietly. Not to him, not exactly. More the way you say things out loud to make it concrete, to give it the weight of being heard, even if only by the room. Ji-Hwan was quiet. She thought about the foster homes and the second-row desks and the gray hoodies and the lunch breaks alone and the years of building an architecture of invisibility so thorough that she'd started to mistake it for her actual self. She thought about the night in the library, not the confrontation, but the moment before it, splitting, when she'd looked at the dead man's switch counting down and made a decision about who she was going to be for the rest of her life, regardless of whether she got out of that room to live it. That was the moment. Not the confrontation, not the contract, not Ji-Hwan, though he was standing beside her now, and that mattered, and she wasn't going to pretend it didn't. The moment was earlier than all of that. The moment was in the decision, in the dark, alone. She reached over and took his hand. Not because she needed steadying, she didn't. She was the steadiest she'd been in years, but because she wanted to, which is different and better and the actual reason to do anything. He held her hand the way he did most things, completely without hedging. Spout stern. Outside, the winter light was doing something specific, the water breaking across the surface in the way that only happened in Seattle in the winter, when the sun was low and the clouds were high, and the gap between them produced a quality of illumination that landed differently than any other kind. She'd noticed it in the first week she'd lived here, at 23, and it had still not stopped being remarkable. The Harmon account review, she said, not because she wanted to talk about work, because the work was part of who she was, and she wasn't going to create a version of this moment that required her to set that aside. I flagged 3 items in the Q3 structure. I'll have the preliminary report by end of week. I saw the flag, Ji-Hwan said, and I'd like to understand your concern before we discuss the report. He looked at her. Which is what you built into the contract. Yes. She looked at him. You actually read it. I read everything you give me. She believed him. She turned back to the window. The city was fully awake now, the full morning velocity of it, the specific noise and motion of a port city doing what port cities do, moving things between places, connecting the interior to the exterior, keeping the flow going in both directions simultaneously. She belonged to this city, she thought, not to any structure inside it, not to Halcott and Pierce, not to Ji-Hwan's estate above the lake, not to any room she hadn't chosen herself. To the city itself, to the specific quality of its light, and its water, and its rain, to the particular kind of person it made when it made you. She belonged to herself. She was standing at a wall of glass in an office she'd signed for in her own name, in a suit the color of the sweater with the torn cuff, with her hand in the hand of a man who had looked at her directly for 3 months and not once asked her to become smaller. She was visible. She was powerful in the specific way that has nothing to do with anyone else's acknowledgement of it, and everything to do with the private, irrevocable knowledge of your own capabilities. She was unashamed. She was completely free to choose the life she wanted. She had chosen it. She was standing in it. Outside, the winter light moved across the water and spread across the city, and Amara Voss drank her coffee and held her ground and watched the morning come in.